Welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. My name is Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we're talking to Jeremi Suri, a professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. And the reason that we had him on the show is because he's written extensively about the fact that the Civil War never actually ended. And so he's a historian of American history. And we're living through a particularly strange time right now where lots of people are proposing that the sky is falling, that this is the worst that it's ever been in America, and that we are all doomed on multiple levels. And number one, I don't buy that. Number two, I don't know exactly why I don't buy that. And so I figured that it would be really useful to have a historian come by who actually had an overarching picture of American history, who could understand the currents of emotion and politics that have run through this place for the last 200 years, to help us trace how the very things that led to massive conflict never really went away, and we've somehow managed to live with them for almost 200 years.
And in parallel, there's been a tremendous amount of civil unrest and violence that has been dealt with in the past that certainly rivals anything that we have going today. And so there's both this intractable problem, but also this sense of cyclicity to problems that arise. And so in some sense, it's very reassuring to hear about the history of civil unrest in our country and see how it's been mediated in the past.
Yeah, because there's just so much history that gets forgotten. And so we get into this weird nostalgic loop where we believe that there was a point that we can return to where it was good. And the reality that is uncovered by any historian worth their salt is the fact that there is no time in history where things are just good. It is always this mess of human potential and the lack of the environment to provide for them. And perhaps there is this narrow window where there's 2 decades or something in the post-war era in American history where things seem like they're really optimistic. But it's important to see them through the lens of historical anomaly, not through the lens of this is just how it is from now on. And so Jeremi's a really good resource for being able to put all of this in perspective, and he, pushes back against the way that we see things and leads us to have a really, really interesting conversation about what's going on in the country right now.
Yeah, it's pretty cool because in some sense it is a history of politics, but I don't feel like any of us in this conversation are trying to defend any particular political partisan aspect. We're more trying to understand how they arise and how those constituencies end up on both sides supporting missions that go against their basic needs. And so it's a really interesting conversation that helps us understand the universe that we live in better, which is what we're trying to do here, ultimately.
And so if you enjoy the podcast, if you enjoy the conversation, consider supporting us on Patreon. We are fully supported by our listeners, which is one of the coolest things in my life. The fact that we make something that we really love, and there's enough people out in the world that love it too to support us. And so come over to patreon.com/demystifysci. If you have $1 or $2 a month that you can give us, it would mean the world to us.
Yeah, and if you can't spare any cash right now, there's a lot of ways you can support the podcast. You could, you still need dollars for that, but you could grab a T-shirt and rep Demystify Sci around the world. We're not making money off those T-shirts, down in the description, but they do have our name on them. Maybe it's a good conversation starter. You can share the podcast with people. You could literally click on any of the book links before you do your Amazon shopping, and there'll be a tiny little piece of that that'll go to us. You don't have to buy anything for us or part of us, but literally just navigating through that link down there to do your Amazon shopping will eventually result in little crumbs flowing our way. There's a lot of ways you can support the pod without really breaking the bank. So all of that goes towards us making better and better programs, putting more of our effort into preparing for these, and we'll really, really appreciate it. Plus, I want to hang out with you if you do join our Patreon. We get together every week on Sundays, and it is, I would say, one of the highlights. Other than our Woods Day, it's probably the highlight of our week, getting to hang out with people who care about these things as much as we do. So I'd love to see you there.
Also, we are looking to perhaps expand our team a little bit. We need people who can help us with booking, with finding guests for the show. A couple people have volunteered to help us maintain a website that's a little bit more orderly than what we have right now. And so if you're interested in helping us out, reach out. We're at demystifysci@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you.
All right, guys, enjoy this conversation. Tell us what you think in the comments, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Let us see in the dark.
Something that I've been thinking a lot about is how people are panicking about the fact that it seems like this is the worst that it's ever been in the United States, in the world, in history. And I have a feeling that that is deeply not true. And even if we set the Civil War aside, I wondered if we could start with maybe a list of lowlights, of like the worst moments.
Yeah, what was the worst election in the history of our country?
Well, I'll take us back a little earlier. I mean, I think a really, really bad time to be alive, far worse than anything we could imagine, would be in Europe during the Black Death. Or in China during one of the recurring cycles of plagues. William McNeill, the great historian at the University of Chicago, who passed away a few years ago, wrote this book, Plagues and Peoples. He wrote it years before COVID. And his argument in Plagues and Peoples, I still assign it to students, is that, and this will resonate, I think, with both of you, that really the way to think about the world and think about history is macroparasites and microparasites. We're the macroparasites. The microparasites are the diseases and the things you guys understand better than me. And there's when stability comes when there's a rough equilibrium. But we often go out of equilibrium, and that's what the Black Death was. There are parts of Europe, and when China went through its version of it, there are parts of China that where everyone died. As a whole, something like about 1 out of 3 Europeans died. And it's not just that people died, is that they didn't understand how they were dying. They didn't know what to do. The best you could do is what Geoffrey Chaucer did, and this is how we get Canterbury Tales. You run away and go into a mountain somewhere and just hope it doesn't come to you. That was a really horrible time to live. It produced one of the most creative periods in the world, the Renaissance, because it gave all of these young people who happened to survive this enormous privilege of being able to experiment and take over and not wait for the established masters to pass on. So it's a paradox. But so if you lived through it, you benefited enormously. But about a third, more than a third of all people didn't live through it, and so that's really horrible. We can't imagine that. Today. Within the United States, I would say, the Great Depression is still very, very hard for us to think about today. Unemployment in the United States was above 25%, and they only counted those who had jobs outside of the home. They didn't count agricultural jobs. They didn't count home care. So most of the people who were counted in the unemployment statistics were men who worked in traditional factory or office jobs. So it really meant that most families had someone who was unemployed, and many families had no income earner because it was maybe one male breadwinner who lost his job, and only like 1 or 2 states had any form of unemployment insurance, and it hit everyone. You could have been middle class one day, and the next day, your law firm closed, and you had nothing. And I try to remind my students what that must have felt like to be a student in college then, to know you were going to graduate and not have a job.
I mean, wasn't it to some degree eventually solved by the government just creating jobs, essentially?
Yes.
Right?
Yep, that's how it was solved. The major solution to the Great Depression, this is not why we went to war, but what really got us out of the Great Depression was World War II, which created government-financed full employment.
Well, they tried the CCC thing quite successfully for a while, too, before that.
Yep, there were all sorts of public works projects. So first, the federal government created, and many states created, aid programs for the first time for people. And one of them, the most famous one, is Social Security. In 1935, elderly people were literally dying of malnutrition in the United States. Now, post-Social Security, elderly people are the least likely to be malnourished in the United States because they at least have some basic guaranteed income that young people don't have. So the federal government stepped in with federal aid programs, and states did that too. Then they created works programs, the WPA, the CCC, which built the log cabins at the Grand Canyon and the pathways and all of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, we kind of live amongst the ruins of that program. It's wild out here because they they haven't been able to maintain them in recent years. So you stumble upon these old WPA, CCC camps, and
It's
you can
wonderful.
tell they've just put their back into these things. They were beautiful at some point, but now they're
Totally.
just these dilapidated, I don't know a better word than ruins. It's actually kind of spooky because it feels like there was a great empire here at some point in time.
That's wild. It's the CCC was a terrific program. It was actually suggested by Frances Perkins, who was the first woman in the cabinet. She was a social worker from New York, and the idea was to put young people to work. And I don't remember the exact number. I think they were paid like $5-7 a month, and they were required to send a part of it home to their families. And they lived in camps. So yeah, those public works projects made a big difference. Most historians would say they put a floor on the suffering. They didn't get us out of the Depression, but they sort of stabilized things. And then it was World War II that got us out of the Depression, because what World War II did is something we've taken for granted now. It made the federal government a main funder of innovation, of science, of the arts, of industry. And we've never looked back. The atomic bomb is one of the great World War II projects, right? And you would know better than I would. It becomes the model for big science thereafter.
Yeah, that one can cut both ways, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
certainly
nuclear power came out of it. I don't think we've embraced the full potential of that application, but yeah.
There was also the chaos of the 70s too, right? I don't know if you saw Brian Burroughs wrote a book a few years ago called Days of Rage.
I've seen it. I haven't read it, but I've seen it.
And I picked it up and just paged through it, and it's basically the history of the underground on the left during the early 70s.
Yeah.
And it is just bombing after bombing after bombing, to the degree that the early 70s averaged, I think, bombing a day.
Yeah.
Of various environmental groups, leftist groups, protesters, civil rights activists, where it was just kind of this thing that was in the water. Like, after, there's also the Puerto Rican separatist students who stormed Congress with rifles.
Yes, that was the last time before January 6th, 2021, that there had been violence in the chamber. Yeah, they also, Puerto Rican nationalists almost assassinated Harry Truman. We've just had a recent assassination attempt, right? So it might be interesting to talk about this. So Harry Truman was actually living in Blair House because they were repairing the White House. It had not been repaired in the 4 terms that Roosevelt had been president, so the house had fallen into disrepair. And so he's living in Blair House, which is the diplomatic guest house. This is a bit before the 70s, but it's of the same element. And a group of Puerto Rican nationalists stormed into the building. The Secret Service had to throw Harry Truman, the president, under the bed to protect him. And one Secret Service agent was shot in his bedroom, but they shot the Puerto Rican nationalists. So your bigger point, though, Nastia, is exactly right. I mean, there was a lot of violence in our society. There always has been, and there are these moments of particular violence, and the late 60s and early 70s was certainly one of them. I was saying to a reporter yesterday that, our world feels tumultuous now, but not nearly as tumultuous as it felt to people living through the late 60s and 70s. There was still a draft in 1968, and one day in January, during the Tet Offensive, 250 Americans died in Vietnam. Americans who had been drafted, not volunteers, draftees. Newark, Detroit, and various other cities were shut down by internal fighting and violence in 67, and then in 68 that spread to more than 20 cities, especially after Martin Luther King's assassination. Then you had Robert Kennedy's assassination. Then you had the Democratic Convention in August of 68, just like this year. Hopefully different this year. Then it was filled with street violence in front of the convention. So that was a much more tumultuous time.
Kent State's crazy. Like, Kent State is just hard to imagine today, right? It's just...
That's May of
really
1970.
Puts things in context,
Yeah, Kent. So it's interesting. Kent State, as I'm sure your listeners know, it was one of hundreds of student protests that occurred after it was revealed that the United States was secretly bombing Cambodia. Nixon had claimed we were trailing down the war. He and Kissinger had secretly increased the war. We were bombing Cambodia. Protests occurred on all these campuses. The National Guard were brought into Kent State University, public university in Ohio. The National Guard soldiers were the same age as the students, poorly trained. and fired upon the students, and four students were killed. At about the same time, a similar thing occurred at Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. But it didn't get the attention. Most people don't know about Jackson State, even though the exact same thing happened.
Students were killed too?
Yep. And the students who died, I think it was 3, not 4, but the students who died at Jackson State were African American. And the students who died at Kent State, the pictures, many of us have seen these photos of the white students screaming in horror.
Yeah, I have a family friend that was there. It's crazy how that protest.
Yeah. So it's both how these things affected us all, but also how race matters and how you view this and how you are affected by it.
Yeah, that's the weird undercurrent. I mean, that obviously touches on the book. Is that your most recent book, the Civil War?
Civil War by Other Means, yeah.
Yeah. So that is something I think that's particularly foundational to the history of this country that you don't. Maybe, I don't know. Do you see that in other countries that there's this racial divide that is at the core of a lot of the conflicts and tensions in the country from across hundreds and hundreds of years?
Well, I think race and other phenotypical classifications matter in almost every society, but they matter differently. What's striking about the United States, and what observers will often say, is that for us it's so black and white. It's not, there aren't gradations. It's the one drop rule, right? If you're one drop black, or at least it was seen that way for a long time, then you're black. Whereas, for instance, in Brazil or in India, there is definitely racial prejudice, skin color prejudice in India. My family's from India. I still have relatives who tell my other relatives in India, don't marry someone who's dark skinned. I mean, that is said, that's in polite company. So that's there, but it's not black versus white. There are different gradations of color. What was striking in the US for so long was you could have a white father and a mother who was, the child of a black mother and a white father. So you really have a mother who's only half African American and a father who's white. So you're really less than half African American, but yet you are classified as African American. And before 1865, you could be a slave, right? And so, and I think that applies to some extent to other races in the U.S. too. So
did that come down to just the legal necessity to divide people into slaves and non-slaves originally?
I think so. Yeah. I think it's the legacy of slavery. It's the legacy of chattel slavery, where you
and just accounting essentially,
counting, and to simplify it for the pure white holders. Now, of course, no one white was purely white either. I mean, that's the irony of all this. These are arbitrary judgments that are made, but then they get the force of law and violence behind them.
I mean, I had this really naive perspective growing up that racism was purely an American problem until when I was in my early 20s, I traveled to Ecuador. And I remember I was sitting on a bus going to the coast, and this guy came over to me, and he had pretty dark skin, honestly. And he was just like, in Spanish, he was like, "Look, you got to watch out for black people around here." And I was like, "What?" Yep. I actually didn't think that I heard him right at first. And he was like, yeah, like black people are bad news, and you got to be careful, like they'll steal your stuff. And I was just like, this is, I don't know, it's obviously unbelievably naive, right? But it really surprised me because I'd kind of grown up through this American history version of that being something not only that we'd more or less settled, but that it was unique to our circumstances.
I think that what's unique about American circumstances is that it might be the country that tries to wrestle with it the most. Because I feel like in other countries, it's just taken for granted. Like you say in India, the conversation about don't marry dark-skinned is just said in polite society. There's no clutching of pearls and gasping at somebody saying that out loud. No one's walking around being like, you shouldn't say that. But in America, there is this sense of, well, hold on a second. We were founded in these ideals. Like, we have a document that says that all men are created equal. And yet we have this massive psychological fracture at the heart of all of our institutions. How do we remedy that? Like, I feel like other countries just don't have that. And because they don't have that, they're able to just kind of continue as usual and just be racist as hell. And just like not think about it.
Yeah, I think to some extent that's true. I mean, the paradox that so many historians for generations have commented on, right, is that we're a society that aspires to be colorblind, that aspires to be all men are created equal, all people are created equal, but yet at the same time deals with, as you say, these strongly inherited demarcations that are very hard to work one's way out of. We are not the least racist society, though. We struggle with this, I think, probably as much as any, if not more than any other society. I'm totally with you on that. But I think what Americans often don't recognize is that there are societies that are significantly less racist than us. What do I mean by that? I mean by if you looked at the things that often matter to us, there are other societies where there is less of a gap between one race and the other. I mean, the most obvious one is wealth. In the United States, the average African American family is way, way behind in wealth accumulation, the average white family. And part of that has to do with the legacies of long-term investments in property, right? And how inherited property and the capital that you inherit accumulates. It's the miracle of investment and compounded interest. And so, in a city like Austin, where I live, in 1924, the city forcibly moved African Americans from homes they owned in part of the city into a segregated part of the city in 1924. They lost property value, whereas there are lots of white families who had property, and over time that property is accumulated in value, and maybe they've sold some of it and then invested in education or invested in something else, and over time that really matters. And that's when we have these debates about reparations, and I have mixed feelings on reparations, but when we have these debates about reparations, that's what gets lost, right? That there's a long historical tail to a lot of this. Other societies that have their own problems with racism haven't allocated property in the same way. And so it's not that France doesn't have racism. I mean, maybe it's more racist, maybe it's less. I don't know. But property is not the same basis of wealth for families as it is in the United States.
It's interesting. I'm reading a biography of Thomas Jefferson right now, and he's traveling in France. He spends many years over there. And at some point, he's writing letters back to his friend Madison, and he's like, we need to make it so that people essentially can't inherit their parents' wealth. And he says something like, it's the world belongs to the living, not to the dead. And in so much as people can just carry on the legacy of their parents, we'll always be working for the dead as opposed to for the living. And like many of Jefferson's big ideas, he wasn't obviously able to pull it off. He also spent many years in his youth when he was first a lawyer fighting for different slave rights, actually, and trying to make it possible for slaves to be emancipated by their masters and stuff. But at some point, being a politician, he just says, this isn't going to happen. And kind of.
But he also was living in the society he was in, and he needed his slaves to support his academic, scholarly lifestyle. He would never have been able to do what he did if he didn't have slaves. That's the irony of that.
I wonder about that, though, right? Because isn't it because he was a lawyer?
He was trained as a lawyer, yeah.
So
I don't know if he was making bank as a lawyer.
Sure, but because I always hear this, right? He needed to be able to have the slaves at the plantation because the plantation was funding all of the other activities. But I'm like, is it just not possible to move to a city and live in an apartment and be a lawyer and then use that to fund your activities in your spare time? Or is that just stylistically impossible? Or
no. I mean, it's conceivable, and to some extent, John Adams was as scholarly as Thomas Jefferson, and he never had slaves and found slaves abhorrent. But the world Jefferson was in, he was a country gentleman, which allowed him to be the scholar he was. I mean, when you visit Monticello, he's created his own, university library and his own reading room and everything. And it's not that he couldn't have done other things, but I think many of the great things he did as a thinker and a writer. I mean, creating the University of Virginia, designing one of the great early universities, right? That came from his ability to have the time and the space to do that because other people were growing his food. He was living off.
He paid for Monticello with bushels of wheat and things off his plantation too. That was one of the things that also really struck me is like people didn't pay for things with money back then. They were literally handing over goods from their plantation to pay for somebody to level their property or something like that.
Right. Right. So that's not. I mean, so it's not in any way to apologize for Jefferson having slaves, but it is to say that we are all. This is our struggle, right? We're all in a system, and we're trying to bring justice to our system, but we're trying to bring justice by working within the system. Usually, except for the few of us who are revolutionaries, and I'm not sure revolutionaries are more successful, right? So, maybe you don't think it's appropriate that we kill animals and eat them. You can stop eating animals yourself, but it's not like you're going to stop those who work with you from doing that. Is very hard to in the world we're in now.
It's too bad he didn't do that. Honestly, it's really too bad. I think there's several passages where he says, I don't see a future where America has slavery, but I don't see how we can hold this country together long enough to get through this revolution if we try to go for that right now.
And I feel that way every summer day when I'm back in Austin, Texas, because I don't see a future where we continue to burn fossil fuels, but I can't live in Austin, Texas without air conditioning. So I understand we can find alternative fuels, and in fact, the majority of the fuels used now in Texas even are renewable fuels. But nonetheless, when I turn the air conditioner up, so I'm not dying in 100-degree temperature, I'm harming the environment. We can't do this forever, but I'm not going to turn my air conditioner off when it's 100 degrees.
Yeah, that's the pragmatic compromise that you have to make in our daily. That's what it kind of means to be human. Honestly, it's pretty much impossible to do the right thing 100% of the time.
I suppose you could move to Maine.
So we go there in the summer. We go to Massachusetts in the summer, but then you have the problem of the winter. I mean, yeah. So if you can move around, I guess we're going back to our nomadic ways. Maybe
you have to burn something in the winter.
Well, not if you're moving around. I hear Austin's very nice in the winter, but that's the great challenge, right?
You'll take a plane there, I suppose.
Yeah, no, horse-drawn wagon. We're bringing back the horses too. I mean, I think that this is the great challenge of empire or state or civilization or whatever you want to call it, right? Because I spend a lot of time thinking about the way that building an institution requires having this motive force. And motive force used to be people. And obviously, when motive force is people, that comes with a whole host of deep and terrible violations. You improve things by saying, okay, well, we can have the internal combustion engine, we can have the steam engine, that lets us move away from it. And so now we have the steam engine and we're like, oh my God, the motive force is killing us. And yet we need it in order to be able to continue. And so the hope is eternally that you can harness physics and science and progress in such a way that you'll be able to replace the thing that's killing you from the inside with something that won't kill you for another 10 generations until it gets to be too severe, and then you have to come up with something new. And each of these transitions leaves in its wake a terrible mess that needs to be resolved.
Yeah.
And we seem to be really good at making messes and not very good at figuring out how to fix them.
Well, or I think the moments of innovation when we fix them are they're concentrated periods. So we have long periods of messiness, and then we have a breakthrough, and all of a sudden we've solved one problem. We're creating other problems, but we don't see those problems for a while. So I think of back to our discussion of the New Deal and the Great Depression. One of the things that came out of the Great Depression was federal investment in rural electrification. So the average family living outside of a city, so living outside of Austin, living outside of Portland, in 1933, 34 had no electricity, which meant they had no nightlife, right? I mean, if no electricity, especially in a rural area, I mean, that's it, right? So rural electrification was an innovation, an organizational and engineering innovation, not so much a science innovation. We already knew how to make electricity, but it was the engineering innovation, being able to do that. It transformed people's lives. Lyndon Johnson, who grew up in rural Texas, remembered, said all of a sudden, like, there was a new life out there, right? So, and it solved so many problems. It meant you could actually be more productive.
Like Robert Caro talks about this in his description
Precisely.
of hill country life, right?
Exactly. It's a great book, isn't it? It's the first volume of the LBJ, I guess 4 books now. He's finishing the 5th. And so yeah, so that solved a problem, and it actually helped with farming. Because you could do work outside at night in the summer now, right? Instead of having to try to do it during the day. So it solved a lot of problems. But then, of course, it created other problems, right? The problem of the pollution, the problem of criminality at night, all sorts of other things. And then, then you have another innovation that comes along years down the line that maybe solves some of those issues, but then opens up other problems. And I think it's that time lag that's difficult for us. And it poses a challenge, right? Because do we want to curtail our activities? Do we want to conserve? Obviously, we have to do some of that, but we don't want to conserve in a way that cuts off innovation. But we can't assume that innovation's a cure-all. So it's another one of these balances, right? We want to conserve, but still innovate, right? So I don't want to use a lot of power now for Bitcoin mining and stuff. It seems to use an enormous amount of power and create all kinds of problems. But I do want to let innovators have access to power and energy, so hopefully they're creating, artificial intelligence and other things that will help us with some of our problems. So finding that balance is really, really hard, and that's why I think history teaches that leadership is an art more than a science. You can't have a formula for that. You've got to feel your way forward on that.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how important is leadership in getting us out of these jams? Like, how much does the president actually matter?
I think the president doesn't get us out of any jams, really. Presidents can make things a lot worse. But
yet that's the thing that people fixate on, right? Is who the president is.
Yeah, but because it matters, though. Because it does matter, because just as we were talking about with the 1930s, and I think this is true for leadership in many settings, they make choices about where resources go. And also and I don't just mean financial resources, also intellectual resources, inspirational resources.
Attention, yeah.
Exactly. And that can empower or disempower. Lots of good work. So one of the best things Franklin Roosevelt did during the Depression was he said, I'm going to use this office to encourage people to come up with all kinds of programs to put people to work. Just what we were talking about, CCC, WP. He basically opened the door to the White House and said, if you got an idea that takes a small amount of money that will put people to work, come and talk to me. Herbert Hoover, who actually was more of an accomplished businessman and economist, right, who should have known better, he thought he had all the answers. His view was, shut the door, leave me alone, I'll figure it out. And Roosevelt's approach worked much better. So those kinds of choices, I think, are the choices leaders make. And there's no eternal correct answer. When we developed atomic energy, I think it was really important, and we should have done more of this, that we had a group of smart people who actually listened to a bunch of scientists and said, you know what, we're not going to go to public opinion on whether we should drop more atomic bombs or not. I think the American public would have supported it. No, we're going to talk to the scientists. So part of leadership is making those kinds of decisions. Where do you allocate resources? Where do you allocate time? Who do you turn to? And what makes certain potential leaders or former leaders really scary is you have very little faith that they're doing that with the interests of the country in mind. The smartest person can make a mistake, but you want someone who's trying to do that based on experience, knowledge, and caring about the right values.
I love that. That's really revelatory for me, the open door policy, because when I think back on some of the mentors I've had across the years, the people I've worked under in different big projects, the best ones were the ones that had that open door and were like, just come, were willing to hang out with me, sometimes for hours on end, and just chop it up about what's going on in the trenches. Totally. I mean, I'd never categorized that as a leadership aspect that one needs to cultivate with a team. Totally. Is that open door feeling.
It's why I love podcasts. It's why I love making them and appearing on great podcasts like yours. Honestly, I'm not just blowing smoke at you. I think that's what we're doing here, right? I mean, it opens the aperture to have a conversation. You don't know where it's going to go, but almost always some interesting things come out of it. And we can't do this all day. We've got other stuff we've got to do, but you make some time for this, right?
And so even if you have good leadership, which I think that you can argue until you're blue in the face if Roosevelt was a good leader or he wasn't, and people will make the argument that he wasn't because they'll point to some subset of decisions that he made that they don't agree with.
Internment of Japanese Americans, 125,000 people were imprisoned, really, without due process. These were professors, lawyers, accountants. I bring that up to make the point that even someone who I think was a great leader, Roosevelt, also made some grave mistakes.
Which is hard to imagine when you're trying to figure out a system as complex as the United States on the doorstep of a world war. Like these are things that are just, none of us know what the burden of that looks like. We just hope that we have somebody in place that makes a better decision than the average person would.
Right, and is willing to correct their mistakes. I think what the historical record probably shows, I think I would stand by this, which is that democracies don't necessarily make better decisions, but they probably correct their mistakes a little better over
That's
time.
really interesting.
There's a version of this that's Churchill's statement, and always with Churchill, it's exaggerated, but his statement is, you can always count on the United States to do the right thing after doing all the wrong things first.
I love that. That's so true.
But when it comes to something like the Civil War, I think that your argument is that we've never really resolved it. We've never actually dealt with this. There's all of this other stuff that's happened in the meantime. World Wars, Vietnam War, massive turnarounds in what it means to be a Democrat or Republican, like all of these passages. And yet over us hangs this fundamental division that has never really been healed. It's just been kind of submerged.
Yeah, I think that's right. That is precisely my argument. And it's not because we're bad people, it's because these are really hard issues. And in the end, a true addressing of these issues would require a lot of disruption, moving a lot of wealth from one group to another. And I'm not advocating that because that's really hard. One has to be careful to be advocating for things that sound good on paper until you think about what it looks like in practice. This is why I love being a historian, because we operate at the intersection between principle and practice, and seeing how principles and practice. We've just talked about that with Jefferson, right? They look different when you put them together. But one of the elements of the Civil War that we never fully come to grips with are the ways in which the legacy of slavery creates structural inequalities in our society. We work on the edges of that, but we don't want to fundamentally address that. It's very hard to address that because it comes down to property and status and so many other things. And it's why immigrant groups like my father, who's an immigrant from India, they have their own challenges. Boy, do they face challenges. But in some ways, their challenges are so different from those who come out of the experience of slavery, and then the experience of discrimination that follows that, and the experience of unequal policing and all of these other things that follow.
And so what is the path forward? Because it seems like it's been around for quite some time, and it goes through waves of being on the surface and waves of being under the surface. We're definitely at a point where it's on the surface.
I think three things about this, and they kind of go together, but they don't. They're not all the same, right? So one is, first of all, we need to educate ourselves about this because it's affecting us, and the desire not to talk about it. It's like that experience. There's something in your family that you're embarrassed by. It still affects you all, right? You're Boo Radley in the closet, right? But you just can't pretend Boo Radley's not in that house, right? The whole point of To Kill a Mockingbird, he's there. You better talk about it. You better educate yourself. So the first thing is let's educate ourselves. We don't have to agree what to do to actually learn about the facts, right? To learn how gravity works, right? It's actually not a political statement to say the United States had slavery and slavery did all these horrible things. There's nothing political in that. That is as data proven as anything else, right? So let's study this, educate ourselves, and then at least we can have a real conversation. So that's my first element of that. That's the educator in me. That's why I like to write about this too, because I actually believe you can educate the larger public. That's why I like to talk about this on podcasts. Second, then, I think we need to have a conversation then about trade-offs, not just about what justice is, but what trade-offs are. Because justice and trade-offs are two different things, but we live in the world of reality, and it's a world of trade-offs. It's a world of incomplete justice. That's not a justification for not pursuing justice, but what are the trade-offs? Just as there's no scenario under which it ever makes sense to deport millions of people, whether they're in your country illegally or not. It's just every historian would say it's going to create so many problems. The trade-offs are too great. The same thing here. You're not going to all of a sudden uproot so many people who have lived in certain places for so long because it's unjust that they're there. Maybe it's unjust that they're there. Maybe they took the land from native peoples. All of us did in some respects. All of our universities did, right? But it's not. It doesn't make sense to uproot the university, right? So we have to have those conversations about trade-offs. Which is more than just knowledge of what happened. It's understanding what the trade-offs are when we make decisions. And then I think the most important move, the third move, is to say, okay, how can we make it better for the most number of people? I'm crassly utilitarian at that point. That's the sort of policy space. The first two are kind of study, examine, research, discussion phases. Then the policy phase is, okay, how can we make this better for more people? And so that let's take a contemporary version of that. That doesn't mean in our world today eliminating police. Policing in the United States grows very much out of patrolling slaves and enforcing the color line, particularly in a state like Texas where I live. It's very close to that even now. And my wife noticed this as a member of the city council, looking at how they were educating police. Even now, it's still very much in that mode. Institutions have histories. But the solution is not to do away with policing, but we could find reforms, serious reforms, that actually allow people who are safe now to be safe, but also those who don't feel safe by the police to feel safer. And we can experiment. I'm not even saying that the three of us could sit down and draw this up and figure it out on our own, but we could endeavor to move in a utilitarian way.
Absolutely. Direction. I mean, most police officers have very little time for training, from what I understand, right? They're not really confronted with a lot of these situations. They should be doing situational simulations constantly, so they're confronted with all of these impossible split-second decisions. And
exactly.
Like, you should be pumping money into it, not draining it out. It's like you're just going to get the worst quality people willing to work for the least amount of money otherwise.
Because it's very weird to have basically a militarized force inside of every single city
poorly
that's
trained.
poorly trained. Because
exactly.
Our town, they have like a tank.
Yep.
Yeah, they're all like horribly out of shape, and like, I don't know. It'd be a very different situation if they were all Navy SEALs or something, and super disciplined and just really distributed decision-making abilities.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
Yeah, that's the scariest part.
I teach a lot of military officers. They come through. We have a program when they're sort of mid-career, and as they're being promoted from colonel to general, they get a year to go back to university. The military invests in this, which is great. I'll have 4 or 5 of those very high-ranking officers in my courses each year. And they look at, especially when we had the recent events on campus with protests and policing, and they look and they'll say to me, they respect the police, as I do too. I have relatives who are police officers. But they will look, these highly trained military officers, and they'll say, oh my gosh, that is exactly not how we would do things. They're doing all the wrong things. Not because these police officers aren't patriotic and care, it's that your point, Michael, they haven't been trained. I mean, the military can invest so much more in training. And they still make mistakes, of course, but they can invest so much more in training. We don't invest in that. Instead, we have weapons because the Pentagon provides those weapons as surplus weapons to police, and they get grants from the federal government.
They
have these tanks, but I'm like, do you even know how to drive that thing? It's like, I sort of doubt that that's the case, and I don't think there's any better training than simulated situations as well. And if you look at the most elite military organizations, that's what they do. Like, whether there's a conflict or not, they deploy. Like, they do these massive workups for their deployments where they're running through all these possible scenarios. They use simulated bad guys and everything, right? But there's nothing like that on the street level where you probably need it the most, because that's where the conflicts are.
Absolutely. No, that's so we should just be clear. So this is not a problem with the police officers. It's a problem with the system and the way we've allocated resources. We could be much more utilitarian and say, okay, this is an area where we can make a difference that makes everyone safer. train them better so they can keep the people who already feel safe even safer, and those who don't feel right. That's why they should learn about implicit bias. I'm sorry, that's not a political statement. It exists. We know this. The scholarship is overwhelming on this. We all have implicit bias of one kind or another. When you're carrying a gun and you have the authority of a police officer, you better be conscious of that. Just as I think we should do more, honestly, to train professors in implicit bias. We're grading students. We're making judgments. Often cases, I have a big class of students. I like to think I don't have any bias, but I've read enough of the scholarship to know I probably do.
Where does that creep in for you personally?
Well,
I also have like huge class every semester too, and it's something I'm interested in.
Well, I mean, to me, one thing I'm always very careful about is I have a bias towards not the students who are kissing up. I see through that very clearly, but the students who appear to me to be working harder. But I have to recognize that there are students who are working equally hard, and I don't see that, right? They're not the ones coming to office hours. They look to me like they're on their, phones all the time, but maybe they're actually reading on their phone. The signals to me of someone who's not working hard are not as accurate because they're the signals that reflect my view, not their view. And the nature of work. The nature of work changes. And then there's there are all kinds of racial assumptions we bring in. There's all kinds of, I have a bias toward, I went to public schools. I have a bias toward people. I respect people who went to public schools. I have a bias because I was always jealous in high school going to a public magnet school in New York. So I didn't suffer. I was a public magnet school, right? I hated the kids from the fancy private schools. And we didn't send our kids to those fancy private schools. But we do fancy universities, but not fancy private schools, right? And so, I don't think that I'm quite sure I'm not hurting anyone with those, but I also do think they sometimes probably lead me to make certain assumptions early on that turn out not to be correct. And I don't know if that'll ever go away, but I need to be more conscious. And I'm sure, we could talk about gender also. So many that I've learned to try to be better in my use of language, not to be woke, but because, when we're talking about leaders, if I say he all the time, what message am I sending to the women in the classroom? That's a real thing, right? And the jokes we tell.
I think it's just brand new to people that that women wouldn't be exclusively expected to be making babies full time. I mean, in the history of humanity, it seems like that's one of the most radical things on the scale of the internet or anything that's happened in the last.
I'd go so far as to say on the scale of biology in general.
Yeah.
Right, like to be able to set yourself apart from your biological function is unique in the entire history of the planet.
Like there's obviously exceptions where women have been able to escape that, but by and large, that's a really new situation, I feel like.
I think so, but I mean, there is the biology of child rearing, no doubt. But what it means to be a woman, just like what it means to be a man, those are things that have varied over time. For the longest time, people would say, and you still hear people saying, people who are gay and lesbian and all this sort of stuff, these are new things. They're being corrupted by modern society. Let me introduce you to the Greeks.
Yeah. For real. Or even the Renaissance.
Any period.
Yeah.
I mean, we have enough scholarship now to show that there have been, throughout history, there have been many, many different kinds of choices and partners that people have made. Even though women have always been the ones rearing the children, right, or at least biologically delivering children into the world, right, that there have been very different kinds of parenthood, very different ways of thinking about partnerships. And it was really only in the sort of 18th through the 20th century in the Western world and then parts of the world where West was able to influence that we came to this very rigid view that things had to look a certain way. And that rigidity was actually a product of that time, not a product of our biology. It had biological connections, but the biology didn't mean it had to be that way.
Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you again. If you are enjoying this conversation, consider coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci. For just a couple dollars a month, you can directly contribute to our project, which is to bring the most exciting ideas that we can find to the rest of the world, and join our weekly patron chat, get both episodes early, and hopefully very soon start to get special bonus patron-only content. And so we'll see you there.
I sense a lot, and people who are coming at it from that perspective, like people like Matt Walsh and stuff like that, I feel like there's a lot of anxiety about the fragmentation of our culture. I feel like it's in some sense this pushback against everybody kind of doing their own thing. It's like, oh no, we need a unified culture, and so they kind of tend towards this oppressive, overly ordered imposition of whatever particular set of values they think is hot.
We had a
Yeah.
really interesting frame for this that was presented by a guy, Andres Emilson, who studies consciousness, actually, and psychedelic experiences. And he put the frame down of team consciousness versus team replicator, where there's the replicators are the ones that have a set of rules, and what they want is they want to expand the pool of people and things and objects that obey their rule set. And team consciousness is, no, you can do your own thing, and everybody attempts to fulfill some version of embodying what it means to be human to the highest levels. And so I think that what you're pointing
He's kind
to...
of like, it's a universal truth amongst sentient, or like, everywhere in biology, even nature, thermodynamics is kind of a war between order and chaos. Like the whole of existence can be viewed in this nutshell.
Yeah, and so when you're pointing to, the neo-trad movement, which is attempting to say that, like, the Make America Great Again, where there is some ideal place that we can go back to and everything was great there, and as long as we hang within these very, very strict confines, then perhaps we can have something that works the way that it did back then. But I think that neglects the value of the multiplicity of ways of being that make life worth living.
Yeah,
It's
make
like,
the future possible to navigate.
yeah, because it's like if you go to the woods, if you show up to a tree plantation, it's a really hollow and frightening experience because it's completely sprayed with herbicides. There's one type of tree. There's no undergrowth. It's a very, very specific, frightening situation. I used to give these really absurd tours when we moved to Portland. It was after we finished grad school, and my goal was, I'm going to work outside. I can't work inside of a lab anymore, and so I found just some company that was doing tours to Mount St. Helens.
Oh, wow.
And I very quickly realized that it was not work outside because these tours were insane. It was a 13-hour day, and like you spent 7 of it in the car. Because you would go like to the south side of Mount St. Helens, you'd go to this lava tube, then you'd drive out to the freeway, you'd drive all the way to the north side of Mount St. Helens.
Wow.
But on the north side of Mount St. Helens are all these tree plantations, Weyerhaeuser tree plantations. And every single tree there is a clone. And when the trees grow up, they're so geometrically perfect that the landscape itself has this kind of moire pattern from the fact that every single tree is identical to the one next to it. And the minute that you end the plantation, you end up in the research zone. And the research zone is this area that was left after the eruption, and it was allowed to regrow naturally. It's a laboratory to see what happens after a volcanic eruption.
Highly recommend everybody visit that place if they get the chance. It's incredible.
And it's incredible because you pass the border of the Weyerhaeuser land, and all of a sudden you're in an ecosystem again. And there's all this massive variety of plants and trees and organisms, and one of the biggest herd of elk in North America. And just right next door is this really frightening team replicator version, which I think is a microcosm for what Shiloh's talking about.
Absolutely.
I mean, we see the same thing. And by the way, just to tie this back to what we were talking about earlier with the academic publishing and stuff, it's a very similar situation. Yeah. It's like, this is what it means to be, in some sense, a high-level physicist or whatever. It's like you gotta stick with that replicator position to some extent.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think the trick is to find order in the chaos, not to try to prevent the chaos, right? And our inclination, especially those who feel empowered by technology or righteousness or whatever, is to make order. The example I always think of, I have to visit Mount St. Helens. I definitely have to see this. But the example I think of is Brasilia, the capital of Brazil that was built after World War II. I don't know if either of you have been there, but it was designed to be a perfectly symmetrical, orderly city. So first of all, it's not designed for walking. You're supposed to drive everywhere. Every quarter of the city looks the same. And there's a government quarter. There's a hotel quarter. There's a tourist quarter. There's a fun quarter. And I mean, and you can see for an engineer who likes order, this makes a lot of sense. Everything is set up in certain ways. And you have that same experience. We were just there summer of 2023. My wife and I were there for a conference, and we had that experience you just described at Mount St. Helens. Like we felt on edge the whole time. Like we came from Sao Paulo, which is this chaotic city like Mexico City, 20 some odd million people. And it's, you get lost and everything has its problems, but it actually feels human. And then you show up in Brasilia and everything is so orderly, and it just feels, everything feels antiseptic. Like you feel like you're in an asylum in a sense. And we were with a group, and almost everyone, Germans, Americans, Italians in the group felt the same way. But, you can't have a city like, like what sometimes New Delhi or Bombay become, where, nothing, you can't move, right? You've got to have there's got to be chaos, but you've got to make order out of the chaos without denying the chaos. And I think that's the challenge.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, the example I think of as the genius of the founders of the United States was that's what they were trying to do, back to Jefferson and others, right? Because the Constitution is not designed to make everyone in the United States the same. It's designed to create a certain minimal set of rules that bring some order to the chaos, but allow the chaos to continue. That's what federalism is, right? Where different states will make their own laws, and so that mix of order and chaos is, I think, an example there.
Yeah, I was going to jump up to the Civil War and just ask if you think that the failure of the post-war period, the ability to actually deal with the fact that you had just canceled this system of slavery that had been around for hundreds of years, was that a lack of ordering? Was there too much the spirit of, well, this will just sort itself out?
I think I'm not sure that's what was motivating it, because there were plenty of Northerners who wanted to bring industrial order to the South. I mean, their hope was, and they got this, right, that the Civil War marks, in a sense, the beginning of the end of an agrarian-centered economy, and now an economy that will still have a large agricultural sector, and still does, but will be more industrial-focused, right? So, until the Civil War, you can talk about the United States as an agrarian economy. From the Civil War to World War II, or really to the 1960s and 70s, you can say it's an industrial economy with a big legacy agricultural sector, and the agricultural sector becomes industrialized too, right? There are very few family farmers, right? It's industrial. And now, post-1970s, 80s, I don't know what you want to call it, a digital economy, whatever. We're still grappling to understand what we're living in. So they were bringing order to, even Northerners were bringing order to the South, but I think they were bringing order without sufficiently understanding the challenges, diversity, different approaches and challenges and needs that different people would have in that setting. And
you made this case in one of the pieces that I read, which was that the presidents directly following the Civil War basically had to make all of these concessions in order to not reignite the conflict. And so in that window of time where you needed to perhaps be able to set up the systems that would actually allow things to change, the systems that we have in place in the country that are national federal systems kind of didn't want to touch the South because they were worried that this would rise, the conflict would rise again to the surface.
Yes, and I think that's absolutely right. And in addition, there was more to be gained financially and in terms of popularity by investing those federal resources in the West. that's where the money was to be made rather than in the South in many respects. Or it was more difficult in the South because there was going to be more resistance. And so the story of the Gilded Age, right, are the New York investors who are putting their money into westward settlement and westward business activities, right? So that's where all those New York fortunes come from. They begin as bankers to the cotton industry, but they end the 19th century as railroad builders, where look at how the railroads run, east to west, not north to south. And it's still true, right? Our travel patterns are much more east to west than north to south.
That's really interesting.
One thing that I was really, I guess I'd heard whispers of this before, but it kind of shocked me when I was reading your book, was you talked about this moment where there was a Back to Africa movement after the Civil War.
Sure.
That
Sure.
was kind of crazy.
Yeah, that had existed before, and it picked up speed afterwards, and it was a combination of things. I mean, part of it was a belief that many had that it was impossible for those who were formerly enslaved people, now non-enslaved people, even if they had legal citizenship, for them to live comfortably in the United States. And some of it also had to do with the fact that you had these new lands that were being settled by empires and taken control of by empires, and there seemed to be opportunity there. This is not the period of post-colonialism. This is the period of colonialism, and this was a colonial idea. So Liberia is actually a colony in many respects of former enslaved people from the United States. So it's interesting how colonialism can overlap with liberation in the eyes of many.
Where did the Back to Africa movement come from? Was it from the top down, or was it a grassroots movement of the freed themselves?
Well, it's a little bit of both, but it had a very top-down element to it because you needed resources to get there. You needed knowledge of those other areas. I mean, most freed former enslaved people didn't have any knowledge of their own about Africa. They had African rituals, African tongues and songs that lasted, of course, right? Ira Berlin and others have written about this, but they didn't have a direct personal memory of somewhere else. So they really weren't saying we're going back to our home. It was much more an argument we're going somewhere where people like us will be able to live better.
And what didn't you mention? Was it Garfield or Grant? Somebody had the opportunity to support that from an institutional standpoint.
Grant did,
but turned away from it at the last minute.
Grant was interested in it. Lincoln had been too, but Grant, as president, was interested in this, and there were promoters. There were also people who were making money off this process. But Grant came to the conclusion that it wasn't practical. That in fact most former enslaved people wouldn't want to do this, and that actually was very important. He came to believe that they become part of the United States. He had a real transformation, Grant did, during the Civil War. I mean, he went into the Civil War with the attitude you'd expect someone who grew up in southern Illinois and southern Ohio to have, right? He had a very racially stilted view of the world. He also didn't like Jews. Early on in the war, there's a lot of evidence of his anti-Semitism. But through the course of the war, especially after African Americans begin fighting in the Union Army, he comes to actually gain enormous respect for the capabilities of African Americans, and in some ways is ahead of his time by the end of the war. I was struck doing research on the number of letters he received when he was president from people suffering in the South, African Americans, white supporters of African Americans, and how personally he took that. He spent a lot of time trying to answer people's letters, trying to deal with their problems. He was very moved by that, so much so that his Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, tried to keep the letters away from him because he thought the president was spending too much time on this. So I think it's a classic example of how the experience with a group you view in negative terms can change the way you view them. Now, I still don't think he was free of racism. No one was at that time, but he certainly had come to a much more progressive view, which is why he took things like what we're talking about here, like a Back to Africa movement, seriously.
Were there voices present in the days after the Civil War who saw the future that we inhabit today, who saw that this problem wasn't going to solve itself?
That's a good question. I think actually there were very few people who anticipated, honestly, the amount of progress that we've made. And we're far short of where we should be if we were living up to our democratic ideals. That's part of the point of my book. But actually, being a historian helps you to see how far we've come. And what frustrates me is not that we haven't come far, but that we haven't gone farther, right? But it's really hard to explain to ourselves to understand how educated people, thoughtful people, good people, God-fearing people, in the 1860s came of age seeing African Americans and Jews and others as subhuman. And they found, I think, a very large proportion of them found slavery abhorrent, but that didn't mean that they saw people as equal or close to equal. Now, I'm not sure everyone today sees all human beings as equal, but I think we're closer to that in our basic assumptions, even among the most right-wing people. I think a lot of the racism we see in our politics is not because people who express those views actually believe certain groups are less human. They might not believe in full equality, but it's more that they feel threatened. Rather than, very few people will actually, I think, defend radical differences, radical biological differences in intelligence. Some, like Charles Murray and others, will make some arguments on this, but even there, they usually couch it by saying it's within a relatively narrow band. Right. That's not how people thought. It was mainstream opinion in very different ways. Then and in other societies, by the way, not just in the United States. It's worth saying that the Nazis, early Nazis, studied American views of race for their own laws regarding Jews.
Yeah, I mean, we were spearheading the eugenics movement, from what I understand.
That's right.
Which was basically settled science at the time.
Absolutely, and as far as I know, through the late 19th, even the early 20th century. So it is extraordinary how far we've come. I can look out at my classroom and have it should be even more diverse, but have diversity of students there, and we don't. I mean, we might have political problems around race. We don't have interpersonal issues in the classroom on that. So we have come a long way. We have a lot farther to go. And I think the problems we now face, like implicit bias and things, are in some ways even harder to solve because they're not always as evident. And so,
I find it really hard to talk to someone with racist ideas who's willing to be frank about it too. Like, it's come up a few times. I don't know. We had a podcast recently. I won't even bother calling the guy out, but it was weird because I sense that there's some anxiety that this stems from when people make these like quasi-racial statements, but they're not really willing to back them up. They don't really want to explore them on their face. It seems to, for me, betray an anxiety that's detached from that. And I don't totally understand where that anxiety arises from, but it doesn't seem like they've really thought through the race thing much. It's just this knee-jerk response to some fear that they have living in them. And I don't understand. I want to understand how that arises in people.
And I think we have to understand. I think one of the challenges, and here I'll side a little bit with those who criticize political correctness, even though I think those criticisms are usually overstated. But we need people to feel comfortable expressing that their feeling of being threatened. Because
let's talk about it.
Because if we don't, then it just lingers, right? And I think it's so much of our politics right now. Richard Hofstadter, great historian of the 1950s and 60s, made this point long ago. I'm just copying it from him, right? That the most damaging moments, difficult moments in a democracy are moments of downward mobility, not upward mobility, right? And I think that's sort of what we're seeing. It connects exactly what you're talking about, Michael, is that there are people who feel that people like them were doing fine. And all of a sudden they can't keep up. And it's people who look very different. And they know in their hearts it's not because the Indian engineers who moved here have some genetic advantage over them or that they're sneaky or these things they say, but they're fearful of it, right? How are they going to compete, right? They want to get their kid into a major university, and they're afraid that now, coming from small town Texas or Wisconsin, right, there are all these kids from Bombay and elsewhere who are competing against them, and that doesn't seem fair. And, these are public universities. It's my tax money. You can, and we don't give them enough of a space to talk about that. I'm not justifying their feeling, but we force them to think they can't talk about it because we call them racist for saying that. And so they go to their own affinity group, and then they find a national figure who will say those things, and they become their own organized group rather than getting into a discussion. I would want to talk to people like that and explain, first of all, the opportunities they have that they're not taking advantage of to be able to get the resources they're fearful of, and to explain to them why their children pursuing a different path now from their path might actually be better for their family, not worse. Maybe the fact that your children won't run the corner pharmacy store in your small town, maybe that's not disaster.
Yeah, like maybe there's something available to them that you just haven't even considered yet. I mean, I think that what freaks me out the most about this is how closed down discourse has become.
Yeah.
Where everybody's very, very policed. And then we see this on the platforms for, YouTube and Facebook and all these other places where the space of public discourse shrinks constantly in the sense that there are plenty of ideas that cannot be talked about because people are afraid on either side of what's going to happen if they get into the public discourse. And I feel like that can only accelerate a move towards greater and greater extremism, exactly for the reasons that you're saying. Because if you can't...
It trains people to think like that.
It trains people to think like that, and it orients them into these echo chambers where they're able to talk to other people in some corner of the internet or wherever, where they...
Or just not even talk about it, but just have it fester inside them, and it's this half-baked comprehension, right?
And so
that was the funny thing about this guy on our podcast who started making these kind of racist and eugenic overtones. I was just he was like, yeah, I don't think you'd be comfortable with my ideas and all this. And I'm just like, let's do it. Say it. I just couldn't get him to do it though, right? Because I think the reality is it was half baked. It was just this thing that nobody had ever actually asked him to explain before.
Totally.
Or he's used to saying it to people who don't challenge him on it. And so he's not ready to actually confront that perhaps the theories are in fact unfounded. Because this was something really interesting. So around 2017, Shaila and I started this hobby where we would go online and we would find fringe theories, whether in science or politics or philosophy, and we would see how quickly we could take them apart.
Yeah.
And we realized that there was this breed of logic that operated on a bed of insane assumptions, where the logic post-assumption is flawless.
Of course.
And so if you take the assumptions for granted, then there's absolutely, you look at the presentation, you're like, my God, that actually does make sense. And then you go back and you're like, well, wait a second, what are the assumptions that went into this? And then you start to realize that it's all of this questionable race science and questionable theories about human potential and everything else. And you're like, oh, okay, so if you start from garbage, you can then construct something that's really attractive because it has the taste and feel of a well thought out argument. But it's basically just based on non-existent support.
Exactly.
And this across the board seems to be kind of the problem of our times, which is that you have people making presentations and they point to these topics that can't be talked about, or they point to ideas that they say are verboten and are able to construct massive castles that are appealing to the people who feel threatened.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how do we break through that? Because if this is the same thing that's been festering for 200 years-ish, how do you pop that boil?
Right. And I think it's an old problem, actually, that's been made worse because it's easier to silo yourself now. It's easier to find the other people who share your flawed assumptions. And so you're not confronted. You're not running up against people who think differently. So I spent a lot of time for the most recent book reading newspapers from the 1870s and 80s, and they're filled with all this garbage. There are so many of these newspapers, I quote a few of them, that say that, Lincoln really wasn't killed. This was a setup,
Mm.
you know, or
Wow.
He's hanging out
that
with Jim Morrison somewhere.
yeah, exactly. He's hanging out with and later John F. Kennedy, or that John Wilkes Booth is a true hero. Lincoln was about to send his armies down to kill us all, and he knew that. He saw this secret plan. So you can just take this in all kinds, and it's all built around, as you say, a flawed assumption to start with, because then they analyze the actions and say the actions, see, they all line up. And people read those newspapers. The truth was that might be where they were getting their news, but they came up against reality in other ways. Most people did. Today, especially in the way our lives are organized and our information is organized, I mean, you can spend all your life, going to 200 websites and YouTube channels and working from your house and, connecting to, and you don't see anything else. You really don't see other things. And that's the scary part. I think that's what's magnified an old problem. I mean, the one that always bothers me now, really, and it's also because I as an immigrant myself, or the child of immigrants, I feel a real direct connection to this. The number of people who have conspiracies about immigrants coming into our society to rape us, kill us, take our money, take our jobs, right? We have so much data on this, and it's not that there aren't problems with immigration, but our society couldn't survive without immigrants. We have too few people doing work, especially the work that most people don't want to do on farms and towns, but also computer programmers. In Austin, Texas, on any given day, there's a shortage of computer programmers. And by the way, have you looked at our PhD programs and where we get our PhD students from, right? So there's
Plus,
a
you're all
shortage
like, not to mention, we're all immigrants. Like, if you go back, I mean, a couple, like in my case, couple generations. Nasty is this generation.
Right.
I mean, it's, come on, like, that's America for you.
Exactly. And this is an old problem, but it's been magnified now, the xenophobia, right? It's a conspiracy theory, right? So they're taking our jobs. Well, no, they're not. They're stealing money from us. Well, no, actually, they contribute in by far more than they take out. And most illegals would prefer to pay taxes if you made them legal. Crime. There's not a single state in the U.S. where the rate of crime among immigrants is significantly lower than the rate of crime among non-immigrants at every level, right? This is a narrative that's been created that has no factual basis. It has just a beginning assumption that people coming from the outside.
Do you mean that the rate of crime among immigrants is higher than non-immigrants?
No, lower.
Isn't
they commit less crime.
Okay, so okay, sorry. That's what I thought you were saying.
Yeah, they commit. So statistically, you would rather have live in an immigrant neighborhood than live in a neighborhood of non-immigrants, because you're going to have more criminals in any group of 100 non-immigrants than 100 immigrants, interestingly enough. And some of that's not because the immigrants are better people, by the way. It's because they're generally careful not to get into trouble, because they don't want to get into trouble. Wherein that kid who grew up in the neighborhood, he's like, if I try to steal your car, what's going to happen to me, right? I'll talk my way out of it or whatever, right? So the point here is that our assumptions are all wrong, our narrative is wrong, but it's such a hard narrative to work your way out of, right? You've all encountered people, right, who are anti-immigrant, and it's not like you can just present them with evidence. Like, I've done this, and I've not convinced anyone.
Well, evidence never convinces anyone. If I've ever encountered someone who changes their mind, they change their mind because they have some kind of spiritual, emotional shift that allows them to see things differently, and the evidence is, if not secondary, then tertiary or quaternary to that shift. It's literally an interior perspective that has to change about what that viewpoint is doing to them and how it affects their relationship to the rest of the world.
Yep, it's a story that they feel, right? It's narrative. This is why narrative is so important. Sometimes it's historical, sometimes it's personal. The classic case, right, is on views of homosexuality, right? So the grandmother who is dead set that gay people are immoral until she has a grandson who's gay. And then it's just what you're saying, right? It's emotional, but also now she has a story that's different. Now she empathizes. Now she sees, well, my grandson is a good person. My grandson isn't weird. Right? My grandson is happier this way. My grandson was not coerced into, and all of a sudden there's a level of empathy. And sometimes it doesn't have to be personal, right? We've all read a novel. I mean, that's why novels were invented, to create empathy, right? We've all maybe seen a movie, and all of a sudden you empathize with a group you didn't before, and that story changes. And then so the evidence fits into that. But you're right; it's not a kind of prosecutorial moment. Don't you see this evidence? Exhibit A. Don't you think differently now?
And so I wonder if there has been a time in American history where being able to get a clear picture has ever been quite so difficult. Because if I think back to the heyday of the newspapers, they were all owned by the magnates who had a specific line of what they wanted the
Totally.
world to see. And so I don't necessarily buy that our access to information is somehow significantly worse than it ever was before, because the idea of a free newspaper that just writes pure truth is kind of a non-existent fantasy.
Absolutely. No. I mean, we are kind of back to normal in a sense. It's just on steroids with social media. I do think a difference today from the early 20th century or the mid 19th century that I had written about too is you had all this biased information. People, this was a conspiracy, Lincoln didn't die, et cetera, et cetera. But it was text-based, and there was less of it, and it was a little less in your face. Right now, you wake up, it's on your phone, and it's not just the story, the conspiracy, it's images, it's sound, it hits us at a sensory level, and we find ourselves, right, all of us are, this is why we have to turn off our phones, we find ourselves getting jumpy. So I do think there's a level at which it hits us that's a little more visceral now, and people who promote this stuff have gotten good at it. I think the Russians have actually studied how to do this to some extent. But I think we're also coming out of a period that was exceptional. So from, I don't know, the mid-1940s to the mid-1960s, was a period of remarkably objective news coverage in the U.S. Now, it still meant certain things were left out. Objective news meant you didn't report on gay communities. I mean, there were things that were left out. You didn't report on initially the damage being done in Vietnam by the U.S. There were things that were left out. But within a pretty wide frame, there was agreement on factual coverage. So science was probably covered better in the U.S. in the popular press from 1947 to 1965, and scientists like Richard Feynman and others would, come on the evening news and actually talk about things, and there was respect for that expertise. But that was about the Cold War. That was about coming out of World War II. People see that as normal. It's not normal. We're never going to get back to that. But what we have now, we have to struggle to, as you said, make it an environment in which we have a better sense of what information we're really getting. Who's sending this to us? My belief is we need to have more transparency. I want to know who's sending me what information for what reason.
For what reason is the trick? Yeah.
What happened in 1965?
So I think the late 60s, it was the civil rights movement in the Vietnam era that shook us out of this, and for good reason, right? Because the criticisms made by students in particular, by young people, were this sort of the gray old lady of the New York Times and Walter Cronkite and that world. Yeah, there was objective reporting within a bound, but they wouldn't talk about the stuff we really cared about. Like they were uncomfortable talking about racism, sexism in particular, right? They were uncomfortable talking about some of the costs of American foreign policy because we were fighting the communists. You didn't want to talk too much about some of those things, and it became more lucrative as someone covering the news to expose the limitations. So this is the story of Woodward and Bernstein, right, who exposed Watergate. I mean, it's an extraordinary story, and it becomes the heroic narrative for journalism. Before that, the heroic narrative of journalism was the Walter Lippmanns, the people who basically spent their entire careers having drinks with powerful people and reporting on that and telling us what they thought, which often was truthful, right? That, having drinks with Einstein, and I'm going to tell you what Einstein thinks about the nuclear world. Woodward and Bernstein were two young reporters who were covering the city beat for the Washington Post. And they stumbled across this story that no one wanted to pick up. It didn't seem like a real story about a break-in and some abstract connection to the White House. They followed the story. They took a president down. And it created a whole new kind of journalism Why should you spend 30 years having drinks with powerful people, slowly moving your way up the food chain? Why don't you go find the scandal and expose it? Welcome
I
to our
often
medieval.
wonder if they hadn't actually gotten caught with their fingers in the cookie jar, if those people who broke that story wouldn't end up like Edward Snowden or something, you know, on the run. I think in some sense they were only able to become heroes because there was actual agents caught in the act of doing something illegal. Uh, you know,
Yeah, they weren't crossing into the national security space, and that's where the Snowden story gets very complicated. So same with Julian Assange also, right? I mean, nothing that they were exposing things that the White House wanted not to be exposed, but things that were not actually secrets of the U.S. government.
mm, mm.
Where in the Snowden case, and it's complicated. Same thing with Chelsea Manning. A number of these, let's call them what they are, whistleblowers, people who exposed information to expose, in most cases, abuses. They were. I mean, Chelsea Manning exposed Abu Ghraib, right? You can't deny there was an abuse there. The challenge in dealing with that, it's the Daniel Ellsberg story with the Pentagon Papers, right? Uh, Governments do have to keep certain things secrets. You can't have people willy-nilly releasing documents or bringing them to their bathrooms in Mar-a-Lago, right? And so, how do you balance these things? My personal view, but I know lots of experts who differ from me on this. So this is my personal view: is that what Snowden did break the law, and that should not just be ignored. But also because what he exposed were real abuses, the penalty for that should be light. It should not be. It should not be super severe. But when you reveal secretive information, there still should be a penalty for that. So I wouldn't want to see him put in jail for a long period of time, but I wouldn't want to see what he did excused either. And I'd say the same on the other side for those who tortured people at Abu Ghraib, who were following orders but still committed torture. Same thing. They should be penalized. They shouldn't be let go because they were following orders. So I do believe in applying the law, but also recognizing the extenuating circumstances.
That's interesting that you say so, because I look at something like what Snowden did, and it's the necessity of that information being public seems to far outweigh the fact that he broke what amounts to an unjust law. Because if the law says that when you discover that there's something happening under the hood that should not be happening, surely all principles of civil disobedience say that that is a law that cannot rationally be enforced. Because
And yet, like civil disobedience are willing to go to jail in protest, right?
And Snowden is willing to exile himself to Russia or, whatever the fate is. And Assange is willing to live inside of an embassy for nearly a decade.
I don't doubt that they've suffered, but I do think in Snowden's case, he's shared information probably with the Russians, which is not good, right? And in Assange's case, there are all sorts of other parts of his behavior that detract from the credibility about what he's done. I am for civil disobedience, and I am for, as you say, outweighing the crime with the benefit. But then we've got to actually look at the entire behavior of the individual for that. So if Snowden stayed in the United States and went to trial, I think he could make a much better case than what he did in this situation, because now there is a real argument about the harm he did to the United States as well.
I think that's a fair point. I think it was just probably really scary for him. I don't think he thought he'd get a fair trial and so forth. It was really just him and Glenn Greenwald, right? They're just two guys. I don't think they had this weight of, let's say, attorney advisors and people they didn't know who was going to back them and who wasn't. And I think there was a lot of chaos probably.
And the newspapers sat on the revelations for a long time too, right? So I think that the entire system seemed to point to the fact that when shit hit the fan, that Snowden wasn't going to have a bunch of people that rallied around him. And if I put myself in that position where I have done something to draw the eye of Sauron of the U.S. intelligence agencies to myself, I would be terrified.
Yeah, I get it. I get it. But he knew that going into it. He knew that when that was not, he didn't stumble into that, right?
That's true. Well, no other country would take him, right? It's not that there was other countries that were willing to shelter him. It was the fact that Russia was the only country that was even willing to consider protecting him from the United States.
Yeah, I'm
Right. I
curious.
mean,
What do you think that he's given to the Russians? Is there evidence of that? I haven't heard that angle.
well, it's hard to. The people I know in the intelligence community believe that. They could be wrong. But no one thinks Putin would let him stay for free.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so it's that's really the logic behind that, and
It is kind of a powerful propaganda tool, though, just in and of
True.
itself, right? To
True.
say that there's this American who, because I think
But
that,
can you imagine the strings attached just knowing that Putin's your landlord? That must be
I mean, that's
really intense, even if it's just self-censorship or just going with the program in general and just being careful about what you say and the light that you cast on things. It must be, I don't know how you could escape that. Talking about not being aware of our biases, I mean, I'm sure Snowden is very, very aware of what sort of things he can and can't get into.
and I do think that he, so the Daniel Ellsberg example, right? Daniel Ellsberg leaks the Pentagon Papers, and he, by the way, until he died just a year or two ago, was a defender of Snowden's, by the way. But Ellsberg didn't leave the country. Eventually, he was pardoned by President Carter, I think. But he had very, very good lawyers because there are people who would defend him, and so. I'm not sure it would have gone as badly as I can see why Snowden was scared, but I'm not sure it actually would have gone as badly if he had stayed as he thinks, right? Because there would be, you're right, the U.S. government was going to come at him like a ton of bricks. But there would have been many, many high quality lawyers who would have defended him. It would also make their careers, right? So you have an interesting incentive structure there. But I also do think I don't want to lose this point because it was at the core of what we were talking about. I do think our intelligence laws are unjust. I do think that there should be more transparency. Our intelligence agencies have too much of a bias towards secrecy. And so
they also have a pretty strong influence on media and all of these other platforms that people use to actually be able to share information, right? Like,
I agree.
you were talking about this golden era between 1945 and 1965. And there's some evidence to suggest that Cronkite was getting paid by the CIA. Like, that was published in the New York Times.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I've seen that. I haven't done direct research on this myself. I continue to think Cronkite was actually, in his mind, being pretty objective, and Dan Rather and others. Actually, I know Dan Rather a little bit. He lives out here. But I do think your point is well taken, and this was one of the things. It really wasn't a golden age. It was an age when we had, within a certain set of bounds that were in part defined by the U.S. government, we had somewhat objective, close to objective, aspirationally objective reporting on certain issues, not on all issues. Certainly not objective reporting on U.S. intelligence activities. But we did have more objective reporting on things like crime, for example.
And so if this is a golden era of reporting, and in some ways a golden era of domestic stability, then you have something that falls out of it that I don't really like, which is that the key to that stability is to never talk about Boo Radley.
And that's the problem. And that's why I wouldn't advocate for that. That's why we can't go back to that. Because first of all, Boo Radley is there. It's harder not to talk about Boo Radley, and it had big costs. Yeah, no, I think this is the whole argument of the '60s. The whole point of the civil rights movement was to say, we're going to put on your television screens what Walter Cronkite doesn't want you to see. Not because Walter Cronkite is racist, but because the standards of journalism are such that you don't show people sending dogs after black men. You just don't show that. And they were saying, no, we're going to make sure you see that because you need to see that that's happening in your society. That was the whole strategy, and it worked. And same thing in Vietnam, right? Reporters like David Halberstam and others said, okay, we're going to break the rules, and we're going to actually show you what's going on. And to your point, Stasia, it's now the Pentagon acts much more now to be careful what's covered in war, so we don't see. There's a lot. We saw more of Vietnam than we saw of Iraq at times.
Yeah.
It's funny because it's evolved to the point now where, I talk about this with people. People I meet, like just random people I meet on the street, we'll start talking about the strange divide between the image that you see on the internet of what the world is like with all of these, you can just open your phone and just see horrific things happening all day long versus the reality of our daily lives. And even the extreme political polarization that we hear about, it's like doesn't seem to really be happening on a local level.
Totally.
And it's like the illusion is very, very strong and present, but everybody's kind of looking around at each other like, what is it? What are you feeling this? Or it seems like everybody's supposed to be experiencing this world that we're seeing on the screens, but it doesn't seem to be playing out in our daily lives.
I completely agree. I think what got us through the period after the Civil War was just that too. I'm reading in my newspaper how horrible this person is or that person is, but you know what? I go to the market, we do our work, there's uncomfortability, but we get things done. I mean, this is the point Tocqueville made about the United States in the 1820s and 30s when he came through. It's like, Americans have different beliefs in God, they worship differently, but somehow they come together and they do shit. And the associations occur, and that's what keeps us going. I was saying this to my wife when we were in the Berkshires this summer. We went to Tanglewood on July 4th to see James Taylor, which I loved seeing James Taylor. He's that's one old man I'm happy to go hear play music.
How was it?
It was fantastic.
Still killing it?
He's still killing, and he's so authentic, and he's so James Taylor, right? And our kids who we don't like James Taylor, they loved it, and they had friends who came and who never heard him before and loved it. But we're out there, there's like 40,000 people on this lawn space. And I'm sure there were Trump supporters, Biden supporters, Black Lives Matter people, because, all kinds of people, right? Jews, Palestinians. And it was totally peaceful. Everyone got along. In fact, my wife and I spent a lot of time in Europe. Like, it would be hard to get a group of Italians together like this, and it wouldn't be a mess, and they wouldn't be yelling at each other. I hate to be stereotypical, but we as Americans still actually we have a culture of getting along, also, and that's what's missing on the internet. But it might actually be, back to Tocqueville, it's our secret sauce, right? Because it's a kind of business, entrepreneur, get things done culture. And I don't like you abstractly, but I'm going to work with you to get things done. And so, I think that's there. And part of what we need to do is tell that story more. I mean, that's kind of what Joe Biden was trying to do. He didn't find the words for that, but we've got to tell that story. It's a story of decency. It's a story of getting along with your neighbor. And, we don't build walls, right? We generally don't have a wall between our house and our neighbors. We get along.
But I think that there's a certain strain of people that want to turn away from that decency. And in order for there to be something like the Civil War, there has to be a critical level of people who decide that discourse and discussion is no longer possible, and the only possible option is outright hostility. And I feel like we're living through a time where I don't know if people are bored, or they're looking for meaning, or they want to be able to exert some kind of power to shake themselves out of the feeling that they're powerless.
I think it's actually that what I was just extolling is in some ways still inflected in a certain direction, not politically, but socioeconomically. Right. So, we can sit there and I'm sure there were richer people and poorer people at the concert. We're all sitting out there, but we're kind of confident, we can buy our cheese and wine and, and life will go on. And I don't know if, we're going to live better, but, we're confident that our lives are sustainable. But there are people, maybe even people wealthier than us now, who are really worried that normal is taking them over a cliff. And Richard Hofstadter's point is actually the people who get most angry are not the people who are at the bottom of the mountain, very poor and struggling to make their way up. They're just struggling, and they're used to struggling, and they've kind of, unfortunately, cynically accepted that. But it's those who are at the top of the mountain and feel, I'm not doing anything different from my parents, but yet I can't get into that university, and I can't get that job. And that other person's coming here, right? And so the normal for them is taking them over the cliff. And that's why you get these very dark descriptions of our world.
This is actually something that, do you know Michael Hudson? He's an economist and a historian of money.
I've read a little bit of his work. I don't know if I've ever met him, but I do know who he is. Yeah.
But he has this argument about revolutions that's very similar, where his point is that we have a picture of revolutions as coming from the basement of the proletariat, the poorest of the poor, and he's like, those people can't start a revolution.
That's right. That's right.
They're literally eking out survival. It's the people that have the money to sit around and
Jefferson and Monticello. Yeah.
Totally.
like to sit around and talk about the ideas and organize and get the tools that they need to be able to do it. And so it's like, it seems almost inevitable that at times of economic fragility that this is the arc. And so if you can't get out of economic fragility, are you doomed to open conflict?
No, if you can do things to ameliorate some of the harms of the fragility for those who are suffering from it. So this is the irony, right? That those who feel insecure, legitimately, many of the things that would help them, they don't support because they don't believe in them, but they actually would help them.
Can you elaborate?
So these are the coal miners who are opposed to Obamacare. You're like, wait a second here, right? You might not like the government, but we're offering you health care coverage here, right? And
they don't like doctors either, and so it's like it's an offer that they don't want.
That's the right, and of course they have the right to make those choices. I don't actually want to say that they shouldn't have that right, but the problem is that what they're being offered, and it's not perfect at all, and it's not being offered because we're altruistic. We shouldn't have a savior complex either, but we're offering them things that structurally can help them to ameliorate the pain they're in.
But I think that the thing that would help them ameliorate the pain that they're in is a return of coal mining as being a job that allows you to support a family.
Right, and that's not going to happen.
And so I think that that's the thing. Like, Shiloh's mom used to work for the public health department in Ohio. And at some point, they had this program where they were trying to fix water pollution levels because people's septic tanks were leaking. And they would have to go around to people and they
like 100% of people's septic tanks.
No.
But they didn't have the cash to buy people new septic tanks, right? So you're going around to all these, poor hillbillies and telling them to fix their septic tank, and they're like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah, and they're getting violent.
Like, "What are you talking about?"
You're only allowed to do that as the Ohio.
I can say that because I'm from a hillbilly family. So.
Yeah, I thought we've got JD Vance on the podcast now, right?
Oh, my family's got JD Vance beat. Yeah, we're straight from middle of Appalachia. My dad has no idea where his roots even.
Well, Vance actually, I think that Vance's story is about Middleport. Isn't that where hillbilly?
Middletown, however you pronounce it. Yeah. He just gave a rally there.
Middletown, Middleport. But the point is that I'm like, look, there's this wild disconnect between what the people need, which is cash to fix their septic tanks, and the approach that the public health agency takes to it, which is you need to fix your septic tank.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so it's the same thing with the coal miners. It's like the coal miners want to be able to maintain a certain way of life, and there's nothing that you can offer them in terms of health care or, retraining programs to get them to become programmers that they're going to go for. Because what they want is they want to maintain this ancestral relationship to the power that they have in a massive global empire that depends on the fruits of their labor. Because then you're important. You are the engine that drives society.
Yep. And this is a challenge for a democracy because the nature of socioeconomic technological development means that coal will not play the same role. And coal miners will not have the same role. It's the same thing with if you look at the people who run auto garages now, right? I mean that's a lucrative job, right? And very skilled people, but the skills are totally changing. I'll admit it. I drive a Tesla, and when I take my Tesla in versus when I take our old Acura in, I mean the people working the Tesla are totally different people. They're computer nerds. Everything's computerized, right? They're not grease monkeys. right? And so those jobs are just going away, just as blacksmiths. There are no blacksmiths left, right? Blacksmithing went away, right? All sorts of family farming really doesn't exist. It's a hobby, right? I mean, there is socioeconomic change that happens over time. And it is the job of government and other institutions to help people to adjust so that they can have equally high quality lives doing other things from generation to generation. And it is the job of human beings to recognize, right, that what you've described as nostalgia, not history, that actually it's going to change and that your grandchildren, you don't want them to be coal miners. You want them to be able to choose what they want to do and to do it at as equally a high quality level of life. And that's, but people oppose that for the reasons you articulated.
Well, I think that what's crazy about this moment in history is that there is a shift towards computerization that is opening a schism in the foundations of how people want to live their lives and how they want to work. And so the schism, I think that the translation for Make America Great Again is really this embodiment of the lumberjack and the Detroit auto worker and this mythos of the American Prometheus not as the architect of the atom bomb, but in fact as the architect of the scaffolding that the country is built on.
Yeah. Yep.
And people are allergic to the idea that in order to participate in that, they have to become a tech nerd because it's not the same relationship to existence as going out and working with your body all day long.
Totally, and there are all kinds of advantages in working with your body. We were talking about spending time outside or whatever, not in cars at Mount St. Helens, but then spending your time outside. The issue here is that it's a misunderstanding of what it means to be a good gritty American. Right, to be a good gritty American historically has not been to do the same thing that your mama and your papa did and that your grandma and grandpapa did. Actually, the story of American society has been, both in reality and in image, until recently, mobility. And I mean moving. Americans move a lot. They still move more than people in other societies, but we move less in the last 50 years than we used to move, right? So you think about it. Andrew Jackson, who's the closest equivalent you come to a MAGA guy from the 19th century, right? Andrew Jackson, right? He grew up in the Carolinas, moved to Tennessee, was constant. His supporters were people who were frontiersmen. What did it mean to be a frontiersman? You didn't stay in the same. You were moving, right? The people who settled Texas, right? They came from places like Tennessee, Stephen F. Austin and others. Our immigrant grandparents, great-grandparents, right, who almost everyone has a story about, they left the old country and they came here. So it's the movement. And why did people move? They didn't move because they just wanted, a different garden. They moved because industry and opportunity changed, right? Andrew Jackson grew up a poor boy in the Carolinas. There was no land for poor boys, but there was land in Tennessee. And so he went to Tennessee, right? My great-grandparents from Russia, they didn't come to the United States because, they wanted to be Americans. They didn't leave the shtetl for that. They left the shtetl because this was one of the few places they thought they weren't going to be killed by Cossacks and that they had a chance to actually make their way. And, they came as tailors and became shopkeepers, worked for Con Edison, did all this other stuff. I don't want to be nostalgic about that either. But that's the American story. So the continuation of that should be the children of coal miners. They don't have to go into tech, who move and do something else where there's new opportunity and create opportunity for themselves and the next generation. But we have become more sedentary in our expectations because we were so prosperous mid-century. And we told ourselves now we only move when we want to move, not when industry and the world. I mean, I go through this with my graduate students, right? It's very hard in all fields to get an academic position, right? But one of the first things
interviewed people who got academic positions in the 1970s with a single phone call.
Yeah, that's
tenured positions.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Anthony Avini, who's like a astronomical mythologist.
Yeah.
Literally, he got the job while he was still a grad student, called up a university, and he's been there
Colgate of all places.
Colgate, yeah.
Yeah, no, And it's a better world that it doesn't work that way, right? Unless you're one of the people who the call was made for. My point is, I tell my graduate students, it's going to be tough. And you know what? You're not going to get to choose where to live. You should not apply if you can't live in a particular place for whatever. If you're like opposed to rural places, don't apply to a rural university. If you're opposed to urban places, but you're not. It's not like you can come to grad school and say, okay, I'm going to live in Chicago. No, we don't know. And that's how our system works, right? And it's this sedentary presupposition that is standing in the way of what should be government-supported, industry-supported mobility, which would give people opportunities.
But I think that I could be totally wrong about this, but it feels like if you compare the moment of your grandparents fleeing the Cossacks, that is a moment of, in some ways, tragedy, because it's their family, it's their house. Like, I was reading about Gregor Mendel the other day, and this probably isn't the case for your grandparents, but his family had lived in the same house for like 100 years.
Right.
Maybe more. Right? So it's deep roots for people who existed prior to these massive turnovers. And so, okay, they leave, but they leave in some sense under the power of their own dreams and vision for what they think will be better. And I think that the great challenge right now is that the people that live rural lives, like we live in a really rural area. So Oregon has this thing which is called the urban growth boundary for every single city. And so the boundary is drawn where inside of it you can have suburbs and you can have tract housing and all of these small plots. Directly outside of it, you hit R1 zoning, which is that the smallest plot can only be 1 acre. And then there's another ring beyond which the smallest plot can be minimum 5 acres.
Oh, wow.
And so it's basically a thing that Oregon came up with in, I think, the 60s and 70s, where the governor visited Texas, of all places, and was like, we cannot turn into Houston. We must do everything we can to not turn into Houston. And so they came up with this idea. And the tools that people have acquired as part of what they do for work are the same tools that they need in order to maintain their properties and their landscapes. Like the marriage between work and care and maintenance of their lot is the same. It is not the fact that because like we bought a grill the other day. And so we had to drive like half an hour out because there was a guy who was selling a really nice grill for, $200. Fantastic. It was a Gen Air, perfect. And we get to this guy's property, and it's, of course, spotless, immaculate. He's gotten rid of all of the underbrush. It's this log cabin in in 50-year-old trees. And then he opens up his shed, and his shed is just tools, lined with the most beautiful collection of tools. It's an incredible workshop. And it turns out that he's an electrician. And so he's acquired all of the tools of the trade. Like, we had to take the grill apart because it couldn't fit in the car. It was this whole thing. And so he pulled out a bunch of tools and we took it apart. But it just struck me that he was so integrated with what he loved, which was machines and tools, and that directly fed into the way that he lived his life, which was the application of tools to the maintenance of a landscape that was fireproof and maintained to live on, and it was a property that he'd clearly been on for his entire life, if not longer. And the idea that he would have 20 years in the past, let's say that, he's 20 years younger than he is, and all of a sudden he can't get a job anymore doing electrician work because it's just, we've stopped building stuff. And he has to learn computers. It's this massive rupture to the spirit that is not the same rupture as, like, I think it's better somewhere else and I can go there. Because it doesn't seem like there's anywhere else to go. There's no land, there's no frontier that you can go to where you can then reinvent yourself and become somebody different. Your choice is...
Why not? Why not? He sounds like a totally skilled person. I bet he could find work anywhere. Not the same work, but I bet he could find work anywhere.
I think that it would be almost impossible to maintain a connection to the land of the same sort because you'd have to move closer into a city. And I think that that's just a tragedy that people are unwilling to to let go of. Yeah.
I agree. I don't think that's anything new at all. I just think they're more resistant to letting go of that. I mean, the people who came from, not even from the shtetl to the U.S., who moved from New York to Texas. There are all these women who moved from New York to Texas because Texas actually had the old Spanish landowning laws, and New York had American landowning laws, which did not allow women to own land for a long time. So you actually, if you have these heiresses in New York who, when their husbands die, they move to Texas because they can actually buy land in Texas. You don't think they had major adjustment issues on at least the scale you've described? And I'm not saying that was pleasant. I'm not making that nostalgic. I'm just saying that's the engine of history, right? That people move, and we have come to a very recent assumption. It's not an old assumption that we stay put and things come to us, rather than our moving to where things are. That is what the engine of American history has been. And people have always felt a sense of loss. Those who left the shtetl, have that sense of loss. My grandparents who left Lahore when it was partitioned, they're Hindu, and so they had to leave the Muslim area, right? I mean, every year, what they left behind in Lahore grows. We were the Rockefellers of Lahore, apparently, because their memory of it just grows and grows and grows. And the Jewish side of my family, in the shtetl, life was wonderful. It's everything. Mark Chagall were depiction of people. Men were men, women were women. I mean, this is all right. Nostalgia over time. It's a sense of loss that's really emotional, that's really felt. But the reality of history is that as economic, technological, sociological conditions change, people move. In a free society, what makes it a free society is that you have the ability to make that choice. And a civilized free society provides you the tools to do that: education, support, rather than pretending. They're people. I understand why they're attached to the land where they are, and I don't want to be. I sound callous about this. I'm not. I understand that. I've felt that in my own family, but the reality is, no matter what anyone does, they're not going to prosper there, and they have to move. And J.D. Vance, Robert Appelage, he understands that. That's what he did in his life, and what's so hypocritical and harmful is he's pretending that what he did to succeed is not what others should do, and somehow we can protect others rather than telling them to actually learn the lesson that he learned, right? Which was he had to, if he wanted an opportunity, the Marines was a way in that direction, and then education, and then he had the world became his oyster.
I mean, so much of this comes down to mindset, unfortunately, and I don't know how you impress mindset upon somebody, but it seems like it's really just growth versus scarcity. It's like you can literally look at any situation, just wake up in the morning and be like, oh my God, there's all these things working against me, and right? Or you can just be like, wow, I have a lot of possibilities that I could pursue here today. It's just, you have to, I don't know what would cause people to look at things differently, but it's a decision we have to make on a daily basis.
I think it's public modeling. I think it is actually back to the stories we tell. And the problem is we are telling, and it's not the people in these situations are not to blame. They've been sold the story, right? Because it's the Norman Rockwell. The small town is the best place, and it worked for a while in this uniquely prosperous moment when that technology actually overlapped with the technology of the moment, and we oversold that to ourselves. So I don't blame them for thinking that. But when they say we've always thought this way, that's not true. People assumed they would have to move. They didn't like it. They had the same feeling of loss. But this entitlement, no, I get to stay where I am. No, you have an entitlement to have a chance, to have an opportunity to make your life better. And society should help. That's what education's about. That's what basic, I think, healthcare should be about. But you don't have a right to stay where you are when there aren't economic conditions that make it possible for you to stay there.
It's interesting because both sides, you can appeal, a sufficiently strong demagogue can appeal to either mindset, it seems to me.
Totally.
You can get people behind you on the basis of scarcity, and you can also get them behind you on the basis of opportunity.
Yep.
And so it seems like we're back to the point where leadership actually does matter.
Totally. And back to the Civil War, the whole reason the Republican Party existed, Lincoln's the first Republican president, it was a new party. It was the party of opportunity. It was the party of opportunity. They weren't selling that, you stay on your land. In fact, it was the party of the small shopkeepers and the small business people who didn't have land and didn't have slaves, like Lincoln himself, right? Who moved throughout his life, right? That you have to move, but you should have opportunity. That's why Lincoln signed the legislation to create public universities, the land grant system. One of the unique American things. He wanted every farmer, he said, to have an education so that they could decide what to do with their lives and have more opportunity, right? That's what the Homestead Act was about. Creating land. Opportunity meant you might have to leave Illinois, but you could have land in Kansas. Or you could have land in Oklahoma. It's extraordinary, actually. You could go as a family, if you lived on the land for 5 years, and you worked the land for 5 years, it was yours. You didn't even have to be a U.S. citizen. You know that? I point this out to people. There were Chinese exclusion laws in most of these areas, so it wasn't actually open to everyone. But there are tens of thousands of Mexican or Spanish citizens, at this point would have been Mexican citizens, who moved into like Oklahoma and elsewhere. They weren't U.S. citizens, and yet they could own the land. Because the idea was that if you proved you'd work on it for 5 years, you couldn't sell it for 5 years. If you worked on it for 5 years, you could own it, right? This is... But it's not guaranteeing you get to stay, where you might have to leave Illinois but you get land, right? I think that's the kind of American bargain.
Okay, so do you think that there is a version of that bargain that exists today? Because that
Yes.
is maybe, okay, what do you think that is?
I think J.D. Vance is exactly that bargain, right? So he made the decision, I'm going to join the Marines. You don't have to join the Marines. You could join some other organization that took him out of the community. And then he went to a public university, Ohio State. He had the GI Bill paid for by the government. But even if he didn't have the GI Bill, it would have been a low tuition in-state bargain, in a sense, right? College is too expensive for those out of state. In-state, it's actually still heavily subsidized, right? And he, based on that, learned the skills, built the networks that he could then go to a fancy law school, Yale Law School. And then he decided to go into entrepreneurship. But he could have gone into a variety of things. He could have become a lawyer. If he wanted, he could have gone back home and probably, like Abraham Lincoln, been a prosperous local lawyer. He chose not to do that. But he had a way out because he was willing to get out, at least for a while, and pursue opportunities that were presented to him. I don't think he would have had those opportunities growing up in the same kind of environment in rural France or rural Germany and or rural Russia. And so that's where opportunity is in the U.S. And it's so frustrating that he actually wants to deny it to other people, isn't it?
I think that there's like a deep cynicism about those institutions that has set in even in the interim since Vance did that.
That's true. Yeah.
And I think that maybe what the strongest barrier right now for that being possible for people is that they have convinced themselves that, joining the military is to support a government that they can't get behind.
Yeah. And they have a right to make that choice, but there are other ways to get it. I mean, there are...
Because there's something very different about go live on a property for 5 years and then you can own it versus go to the military so that you can then go to college, so you can then figure out what to do after college. Like there's a certain, I've long thought, and I thought this about myself, where I was like, I don't know that I should have been a person who went to college. Like I didn't want to. I didn't like school. I liked ideas, I liked reading, but I was forced into it in a way that I feel like really constrained my ability to think about the other possibilities that were open to me. And that was because I came from a family where it was like, okay, well, you would be the first person in like 5 generations to not go to college. Like you're going to college. And and we taught when we were in Portland at these schools where students were being pushed into going to colleges, no matter what their circumstances. They were all on the same track where I remember very viscerally, there was one student who I was teaching a math class or something. And the teacher in the morning was there and she was like, okay, watch out for Billy or whatever. Billy's going to be in 4th period. And so just as soon as he comes in, just send him across the hall because Billy's a real problem.
Oh, gosh.
And I was like, poor Billy. and immediately
Yeah.
forgot about it, right?
Yeah.
Like
Good for
in one
you.
ear and
Good
out the
for you.
other. And then fifth period rolls around, and there's this kid who's just a terror. Like, he's literally a terrorist. He's like, everybody else is working. He's walking around. He's like chuffing people in the backs of the heads,
Oh.
like throwing things. And finally, I pull him out into the hall, and I'm like, okay, what's your name? He's like, I'm Billy. And I'm like, got it. Okay, Billy, what's your problem? And Billy's like, well, I don't need to learn this stuff. I'm going to be a mechanic. My uncle owns a body shop, and I already work there. And after I leave school, I'm going there, and he's going to teach me how to do it, and I'm going to take it over. And it just struck me what a disservice was being done to Billy, because he needed to learn math, but he needed to learn math in the sense of, you're not going to go to college, you're going to learn how to run a body shop, and you need accounting, and you need to be able to do the math for the body shop. And it just strikes me that a program that would allow people to make the entrepreneurial dream happen for themselves in a place like America, it would be much more powerful and palatable than this idea of, go to the military, go to college, become one of the, elite or whatever else. Like, that's not for everybody. The people who moved across to the West to farm that land were not people that were destined for college. I'm sure that they were deeply intelligent and capable people, but
Sure.
there's a direct, like, the arc proposed there is an arc towards knowledge worker.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think it's a strong point. It's compelling. I have a different point of view, but I don't know if I'm right and you're wrong. I could be wrong and you could be right. But my view is that college is becoming the new high school. I mean, what you say about college is what people said opposing high school in the late 19th century. High schools were invented in the U.S. Kindergarten was obviously invented in Germany, right? High school was invented in the U.S. It was invented in urban settings in the U.S. There had always been finishing schools, but the notion of public high school that I don't think anyone would oppose now, right? That's a 1870s, and there are versions of it in the 1840s, but it becomes de rigueur normal in urban areas in the 1870s and 80s. And in part, it was because people needed to be literate and numerate to work in factories. And so it was actually sponsored. The places where you have lots of high schools tend to be the places where you have lots of business interests that are sponsoring these schools. So there is that vocational connection. But the idea is also that you were training citizens. What did businesses want? They wanted workers who were numerate and literate, and they wanted workers who were good citizens, right? Because a good citizen is a good worker, and a good worker is a good citizen, right? And so that's why they would teach history, and that's why they would, teach literature. They would read Shakespeare. This was also Lincoln's dream, right? That every poor boy like him would not have to learn Shakespeare on their own, as he did, but would actually read it, right? So they would learn to speak, and that would make us better. That would make us all better. And the beauty of the public high school was it wasn't going to be done in a religious frame. It wasn't anti-religious, but it wasn't just going to be the Catholics and the Protestants. It was actually an integrated idea, not integrated by race, but you would have literally Jewish, Italian, Catholic, German, Protestant kids going to the same classroom, learning English, reading Shakespeare, learning math, and they had all the friends who were historians of education had all the problems we have today. We think truancy is a new issue. They had all these issues. Violence at schools, gangs, none of this is. And teachers always complained, always thought it was worse in their time than the time before, and teachers were never paid enough. I mean, this is just an old recurring story. College, it seems to me, has become the high school, not because we're trading knowledge workers, but because to really have opportunity in our world, to do anything, even to be an electrician or to work on an electric car, you need to be able to engage with a wider world. You need to be able to take in information. And just what we've been talking about, you need to be able to sort critically through bullshit and misinformation that is thrown at you all the time, right? What do I really want when I take my car in? I want someone who actually doesn't just have experience working on the car, but actually knows what the hell is going on, and what needs to be done based on the ways the technology is changing, can sort through that in a knowledgeable way and say, yes, I need this or I don't need this, or whatever it is, right? Same thing on my house, right? Am I going to put a solar roof on? What does it mean? All that, I want someone who actually has sorted through all that. That does require not a fancy college education. You might get a better version of that at a community college, but it does require, I think, that level of critical engagement, that level of interdisciplinarity, that level of learning to learn and sorting through information and communicating and all of those things. And I think we offer that in our society, and we offer it in a way that is affordable for people if they look for it in the places where it is affordable and offered to them. The problem we have is people are being sold. They're being sold the promise that they're going to get rich. That's not what college is about. And they're being sold that they can do it at a fancy place, and if they pay a lot of money, they'll get more out of it. But I would think that any, especially in a state like Ohio, where there's so many universities, any even poor kid can find a decent college to go to and actually have a world open up to them. And we know, by the way, we have data. College graduates have a very, very low unemployment rate. And here's the other thing about college debt. College graduates who go to public universities, especially in their own state, have almost no debt. The debt problems are, first, those who don't finish college, those who start and don't finish, because you get no economic value out of just being there. You get it from the degree, right? They don't finish, and then they tend to go to fancy places or places like Trump University where they're being sold a bag of goods. But go to the local branch.
I think that's the thing that we experience a lot. Like even in our like we teach at a university that has very high acceptance rate and a very low graduation rate, and it's a little bit tragic because you do end up with these kids there who just aren't. Their heads are and hearts aren't in it, right?
But it is a public university. And
so the question is there a place for those people to go that maybe 5 years from now they would figure out, maybe they need to take a trip through the Marine Corps or whatever it is before they realize that this is something that can actually connect with them and that they can put themselves into. I think a lot of those kids showing up that it's really tragic too, because you end up with them in your courses and they're just not showing up. It's sad, and they're just dishing out thousands and thousands of dollars, and it's a bummer.
It might be, and this I think may bring our perspectives together, that it isn't necessarily the thing that every 18-year-old should do.
Right.
And that's, again, because we've come to live in a world where we want everything overly ordered. It's like the trees at Mount St. Helens. We want every student to be the same age, and we want to say, okay, you come from 18 to 21, and then you go to graduate to law school or whatever else. You've probably had people come on and talk about this who know this much better than I do. My observation reinforces the little bit I've read on the biology of boys and seeing my own son, that actually 18-year-old boys have a hard time in any kind of organized, extensive learning environment. They're curious, but they just, unlike girls on average at that age, they're hormonally not capable of sitting and listening to an hour-long lecture. And so maybe that should be at a different time. Maybe they should go get work experience first. Maybe I'm for apprenticeship programs, right? I'm for all kinds of things like that. Maybe they apprentice as an electrician and then come back to school to read Shakespeare. But I think that should be part of the course of one's life.
Bring back the CCC.
Yeah.
Oh, it's actually funny because we had students and we were talking to them about the CCC. No, it was not students that we had. We ended up, we were in New Mexico, and our friend took us to some hot spring. And Shiloh and I are sitting in the hot spring, like trying to explain to the guy why we think black holes don't exist.
College kids? Yeah, we just ended up in this hot spring with a bunch of college kids.
Yeah, and there's like all these college kids that are sitting there, and Shiloh and I are like deep in this conversation with our friend about black holes, and the friend is just like, "Oh my God, you guys are so embarrassing," and the college kids are just. You can tell that they're
like
really, really curious because they're inching closer and closer. And eventually we get into a conversation with them, and they're, climbers and out on some spring break trip. And we got to talking about the CCC, and they were like, yeah, it's too restrictive. You have to work all day long, and they don't pay you very much. And it's out there. You can go join a youth corps organization, but it's basically the same principles as it was in the CCC. You live in a tent. They pay you pennies. Yeah. And they just don't want to, which I understand because it's a really, really hard life and you have plenty of other opportunities. They're like, you can't even go on a climbing trip. And I'm like, Yeah, that's true. Like you gotta chop wood all day.
Yeah. And by the way, just to build on this, maybe to groups like that, a different way of bringing them a college education makes sense. I'm also not saying that college education has to be everyone coming, and maybe the kids who are not ready in your classroom, that mode of learning doesn't work. But maybe an online mode works. Maybe it's 8 years with fewer classes. There are all kinds of. When I say college, I'm not saying exactly as we do it now, but I am saying exposing people. I'm very worried about a world where we say, okay, some of you choose to become vocational, and some of you choose to become intellectual. And what happens in that situation? We all know too many cases of people who started their lives vocational and then found this intellectual reservoir of interest they had and found so much more meaning in life, maybe not even professional, but outside their professional world in learning.
And I think the apprenticeship thing is absolutely killer. I would recommend that to all students before they go to college or before. Like I took like 10 years off after college before getting my PhD.
Wow.
And it was awesome because I showed up to do my PhD and I was like, I know how this works.
Precisely.
And I saw these kids show up even from like Princeton and Yale, and they were just, they'd then used to somebody telling them what to do their whole, and it was disastrous for a lot of these people. They're brilliant. They're smart kids, super ambitious, well educated, but there's nothing like being on the scene and figuring out how the lay of the land is.
Well, that's also because Ivy League universities have a sense of like, we're not really here to teach you. Like we went to Columbia, and so these kids were showing up and they were hoping to be matured by the process and having somebody who would really hold their hand and teach them. And Columbia just wants people that they can slot in like gears to the workings of the lab so you can crank out nature papers or whatever. Like they have no interest in holding your hand. And so if you're superb.
It's so sad for so many people. Oh my God.
Yeah, it was tragic to watch. But I think that to wrap this back to the conversation that we were having earlier, which is that frightening economic times seem to inherently lead to the rise of extremism and frustration because there's a palpable sense of there not being enough.
Mm-hmm.
And we have managed to construct so much order into our systems where the people who feel the most threatened can't navigate through those systems in a way that's flexible enough for them or whatever, in order to feel like there are opportunities elsewhere. Because I think that your point about the history of America being a history of mobility is really, really apt. Like, no one showed up here without breaking every single bond that they had.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's going to be one of my favorite things I take away from this today. I'm really, really stunned by that revelation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, and it's where being educated about history matters. You don't have to be a historian. You don't even have to go to college to be educated about history, right? But we make assumptions about our own lives based on assumptions that, even if we don't realize it, that are historical assumptions that are just wrong. And what history does, the reason I love studying history, is it's not nostalgia for the past. It's just the opposite. It's opening up and seeing that actually there were different pathways in the past, some pursued, some not, that we can pursue today. It widens the space of choice for us. Because if you don't know history, you think what we do is what we have to do. It's always been this way. Sorry you're not happy, but it's always been this way. And then the historian says, no, it hasn't always been this way. Maybe it was worse, maybe it was better, but it hasn't always been this way, and it could be different, therefore.
Other than your own books, what's your short list of books about American history that you think people should read?
Oh gosh, that would be a very long list. But Richard Hofstadter, who I mentioned before, Hofstadter, from the 1950s and 60s. He wrote about the American political tradition. He wrote about progressive ideas. Any book by him, he wrote like 8 or 9 books, is worth reading. I think one of the great books on understanding slavery and freedom, by a historian named Edmund Morgan. And Edmund Morgan's book is called American Slavery, American Freedom. He wrote like 15 books, but American Slavery, American Freedom is focused on Virginia. And he explains how freedom required slavery and how these two things could be brought together, and it teaches us how opposites often coexist. I'm sorry, I'm getting choked up as I talk about all these books I love. A book my advisor, my PhD advisor at Yale, wrote, Paul Kennedy, Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, makes the point that large, powerful countries, I think it applies to any organization, they overexpand, they get hubristic, and then they end up spending their resources to defend their overextensions rather than their core interests. I think there's such a important lesson in seeing how various societies have gone through that. What else would I name? I love a book by Felix Gilbert called "To the Farewell Address" about George Washington and the early principles of American society. And I could go on and on, but that would start us out there.
Excellent. I mean, I think that we are at a time of high strangeness, and I don't mean that necessarily in the UFO sense. I mean that just in the sense of it's a weird year, and everybody is screaming about the fact that this is the end of democracy as we know it, and the sky is falling. And I think that nowhere is it more urgent, at no time is it more urgent to look deeply into history, to be able to understand these currents, because they don't come from nowhere.
That's right.
Your point that this is an old flow is really vital for these times, I think.
Man, I know we're kind of winding down, but I really wanted to ask you, because you've referred to democracy several times. Do you think that we're living in a democracy right now?
I think we are living in a society that has many democratic characteristics, as in characteristics of a democracy, not of a party, but has many characteristics that are not democracy. And that's always been the case. We've been a mix of those things. The founders aspired to be a democracy, but not a complete democracy. And over time, our democracy has become fuller at certain moments and lesser at other moments. It's fuller now than it was in the 18th century, but it's lesser than it was 20 years ago. And that's because of choices that have been made, but it's also because of manipulation of the system. Gerrymandering, for example, has made us far less of a democracy. The misuse of power by this, or the overuse of power by the Supreme Court, has made us less of a democracy.
I feel a lot of like a sense of like impotency in terms of voting. Like people on the street seem to think, well, it doesn't matter. And there was this study that we referenced a bunch.
A Yale study, actually, that they looked through it and they were like, voting doesn't actually do anything.
Like people vote on these things, but the policies kind of go whatever way they go. And there's like a helplessness that I detect sometimes about that.
Yeah, and there is something to that. I think that also becomes a learned helplessness. You just sort of convince yourself it doesn't matter. There are many ways in which we are more of a democracy than we were before. Today, in almost every part of this country, you have more freedom to marry who you want to marry than ever before. Right? It's still not perfect, but much more so, even in the last 10 years. That's right, is under President Obama that we get the protection for the rights to marry people of the same sex or whatever else. So I think it depends on the issue, but I think we've gone in the wrong direction the last few years. And the worry is that at this election, if this election goes one way, we're going to go in a direction that is less democracy than the other way, which is going to be more democracy, but neither way is going to be full democracy yet.
I think both sides probably feel that way, is the funny part.
Yeah, I think they do, but I think the people who support Trump, I think they're driven much more by power than by democracy. I think when they say democracy, they mean power. There's a fear of losing power or what will happen if they don't have power. I think on the Democratic side, it's not that they're always right, but I think there is a commitment to certain principles of democracy that might serve the interests of their voters too. But, the Democratic Party now supports expanding voting rights. Sure, they think it's going to be more of their people who vote, but not always. And the Republican Party is not for more voting rights. I mean, that we have to call something what it is. If you're for more people being able to vote, I call that more democracy. If you're doing what the Republicans are doing in Texas, making it harder for people to vote, so the Democratic county judge who basically runs Houston, they had 24-hour voting in the last election in 2022 because Houston has not the biggest profession in Houston is not oil, it's actually nursing and doctors. And there are all these Filipino American and Indonesian American nurses who have long shifts and can only vote late at night. There was no evidence of any fraud. Republicans in the state shut that down because they didn't want those people voting. I mean, you can be a Republican or Democrat on principle, but you have to recognize that one side was for democracy there, and one side was not.
My friends I have that are like more on the Trump side of things, they seem to point at revolving doors in federal agencies and corruptions and capture of different arms as being this anti-democratic thrust of the mainstream democratic thing too. I'm just saying, like, people can make a case from either, right? There's like, I think both people are just like, I'm trying to save the Democratic Republic. Like it's coming from all sides
yeah, I just think that, yes, but I just think that if you are trying to get more people to make decisions, that's more toward democracy. If you're trying to get fewer people to make decisions and fewer people to vote, that's less toward democracy. It doesn't mean that there aren't anti-democratic elements on both sides. But I also just think the figure of Donald Trump and the things that people apologize for his behavior on, there is a dictatorial quality that people are supporting there, and that's dangerous. He is a demagogue. He fits all the historical. Now, maybe you like demagogues, but
I think it's just opposing. Like on the other side, it's like a totalitarian perspective, also, right? This like massive bureaucratic state agency thing that's scary to people as well. So it's like both nightmares can be held by either side, I think.
If you subscribe to the horseshoe theory of politics, right, where it's like if you go too far to the left and you go too far to the right, you end up in the exact same nightmare.
Totally. I just don't think the evidence is there. You can tell a story, but I don't think the evidence is there of bureaucracies doing to people on this scale.
Well, the Soviet Union, I suppose.
No, but I mean the United States. Yeah, of course. And the Soviet Union was, of course, hybrid, right? Yes, it was a bureaucratic state, but there was a Joseph Stalin who had actual execution lists
in the beginning. Yeah, but the bureaucracies kind of kept it going.
Well, the worst part of the state was while the guy who had the lists of executions was still around.
Yeah, I just want to be careful we don't rail. There are problems of bureaucratic overreach. But in American history, those have been far less of an issue than the problems of the misuse of power and force to storm the Capitol which happened, as I write in my book, what happened on January 6th happened repeatedly at the state level in the 19th century, where mobs went and overthrew elected governments. That is much more of a problem in our society than bureaucracy taking away people's freedom. Not that bureaucracy can't do that, and I'm sure we could come up with examples of that.
I think that what I see people on the right really in fear of is that the tech ecosystem is largely owned and governed by people that have a certain political bent. And there's the occasional outlier, like I would say Peter Thiel is probably pretty far on the right, and probably Lucky Palmer, the guy who runs Palantir, is probably pretty far to the right. But in general, when you look at the social media networks, they align with a far more left-leaning view of the world. And so it seems like the disparity of fears is the left is afraid of the demagoguery of what the MAGA tribe represents and the very militaristic flavor that it often has. And the right is afraid of this closing of the public sphere down to a set of things that can and cannot be said.
Yes, I'm certain that's an argument that's made, and I think it had more persuasive power. It had more evidence to it, and it was a more compelling story a few years ago than it is today. Right? So most people in Silicon Valley and in the Austin tech community, they're libertarians. There's
a lot of libertarians in tech.
Yeah. So they tend to be left of center on issues like gay marriage and abortion, but they tend to be right of center on issues of bureaucracy and regulation. They don't want their stuff regulated, and they don't like the fact that Biden was talking about regulating AI and crypto. And that has led to a lot of these, certainly not a majority, but a lot of these major tech figures actually supporting Trump now, right? Musk. You mentioned Peter Thiel, who I actually went to college with. David Sachs, who I also went to college with. They were all at Stanford at the same time I was there, right? Joe Lonsdale, all the Palantir people, all of them, they all support Trump because they see him as in their pocket more. They're giving him money, and they also believe that he will regulate them less. And so it's really not right to say that. I bet if you did a survey, the majority, yes, in the tech world, probably lean more to the left than to the right. But the big money there, it's not as clear anymore, right? And they're libertarians. That's the other point that needs to be made there. And I think that shutting down speech is something I'm really concerned about too. I'm almost an absolutist on free speech. And I used to believe, actually, that was one place where the right had a point. And I actually would agree with that. I'm on record. What I've seen the last few years is much more canceling from the right than from the left.
It's been really wild to watch what happened after the assassination attempt, especially, right? Because there was this whole thing about, leftists being the ones that were out to destroy the lives of right-wingers and doxing them on the internet and getting them fired for their unacceptable opinions. And you saw all of these people on the right. I spend too much time on Twitter, and so had front row seats to this.
Yeah.
Like, all the people on the right were like, my God, this is so immoral, so wrong. And then the tide turns, and all of a sudden you see that they're perfectly happy to use the exact same tools.
And I saw that with regard to the protests after October 7th. Let me be clear. I believe Israel has a right to defend itself, but I also think Israel has done some things, I say this as a Jew, that are worthy of criticism. And I'd like to see a discussion just like this about that. There has been so much pressure from the right to shut down those discussions, to go after students who are protesting. Not the crazy protests, I've seen this myself, just trying to express themselves. There's been enormous pressure in the name of religious liberty to protect Jews against anti-Semitism. People who someone tried to burn down my synagogue where my family goes near us, and no one from the state wanted to help. My wife's on the city government. She looked to the state for help. They offered no help at all. The city was helpful. They offered no help at all. And now those same people who offered no help when someone tried to burn down our synagogue are jumping up and down to protect against anti-Semitism at the university when pro-Palestinian speakers come. The very same people who didn't care when someone attacked, because it was a right-wing kid who attacked our synagogue. And so they don't believe in that. That leads me to recognize they don't believe in free speech. I will be happy to support anyone who believes, because I do think free speech is a core value. We need to have more dialogue. I don't see a strong argument on the right for that anymore. I think they've abandoned that.
Yeah.
All right, kids, stay away from tribes. Learn how to think for yourself.
Absolutely. Speak freely, right? And encourage others to speak freely.
Ask weird questions. Yeah, 100%.
All right.
All right, Jeremy.
Thank you.
We'll let you get on with your day, but it's been really fun to talk to you, man.
Me too.
You've given me
I've
some
enjoyed
gems to think about in the days to come.
I've enjoyed it a lot. It got me away from other things. I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate all the time and effort you guys put into doing this, to preparing for it, and I look forward to seeing what it looks like when it's done.
Excellent.
Yeah, man. We'll be in touch.
All right. Take care. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.